As you know, in these 3 lessons, I will try to recount the crucial moments of World War I for Italy. This year's festival is dedicated to the community, and there is no doubt that World War I is a moment when Italy made a significant step forward towards being a cohesive national community. It is one of the milestones, 50 years after the unification, that pushed Italy to become more than ever a community. However, be careful. It is not necessarily only a positive thing. The community is not just the place of coexistence and solidarity. The community, to begin with in history, almost always, when it is strong and cohesive, desires nothing more than to subjugate neighboring communities and eventually annihilate them. This is clearly seen in the program with which Italy entered the war and in the way it subsequently managed the victory. And then there is another thing. The stronger and more cohesive the community is, the more it feels like a community. And when someone wants to lead it in a certain direction and meets resistance, those who disagree are seen as traitors, traitors to the national community, in the pay of the foreigner. And this was clearly seen in Italy in 1915, in the Italy that I will try to tell you about this first evening, the Italy that enters the war. So, as you know, Italy enters World War I when the war has already been going on for almost a year. What our elders called the 1518 War is known to the rest of the world as the 1418 War. We entered the war on May 24th, 1915. A long time had passed since that June 28th, 1914, when the assassination in Sarajevo triggered a terrifying dynamic that within a month plunged the entire world into war. An assassination is a context, if you will, very familiar from our perspective today. That is a war triggered by an impressive act of international terrorism, a situation that we can understand very well. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was assassinated in Sarajevo, Bosnia. Bosnia had been unilaterally occupied by Austria for a few years, causing discontent among many, including Serbia, which is the neighboring country. A small group of terrorists of Serbian nationality in Sarajevo that day shot and killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie. In Austria, the reaction is obviously particularly intense. They have killed the heir to the throne. Emperor Franz Joseph is very old. It is now clear that he will die very soon. That was the heir. He had been preparing for years to take power, and now he is dead. In his place is a young man who is inexperienced and unqualified, who will later become Emperor Charles. It is a huge shock. Austria is convinced that these Serbian terrorists have complicity in Serbia, within the state, in politics, the military, and the Serbian intelligence services. And Austria decides that the time has come to put an end to Serbia, which has been obstructing Austrian expansion in the Balkans for too long. I will tell you how all the other powers entered the war before explaining that Italy, on the other hand, remained outside at that moment. The war begins with Austria sending Serbia an ultimatum that amounts to war, as Serbia would have to submit to an investigation conducted by the Austrians with full powers on its territory, which no state could accept. So it is certain that there will be war. Austria bets that since Serbia is clearly a rogue state, to use our modern language, that supports terrorists, then no one will have anything to say if Austria punishes Serbia. However, Serbia has a big brother, the Russia of Tsar Nicholas, a great power, Slavic like Serbia, Orthodox like Serbia. And Russia enters the war to defend Serbia, declaring war on Austria. But Austria also has a big brother, Germany, the Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm, the Second Reich. The Tsar of Russia, Nicholas, hopes that after all, Germany will stay out of this war. First of all, because Tsar Nicholas and Kaiser Wilhelm are first cousins. They played together as children. They call each other Nicky and Willy. And Tsar Nicky is desperately trying to convince his cousin Willy not to go to war against him. Between July and August 1914, there is a frantic exchange of telegrams between the Tsar, who signs as Nicky, and the Kaiser, who signs as Willy. The telegrams are in English, of course, in which Tsar Nicky tells Willy, "But you see, I have to go to war against Austria to defend this small country. Serbia has been wronged unjustly, but you will stay out of it, right?" And Willy replies to him, "But no, I am allied with Austria. Look, if you declare war on her, I will be forced to enter." They go on like this for a few days until Willy declares war on Nicky. But Russia also has another great ally, France, which has hated Germany since the War of 70 over Alsace and Lorraine, which is very afraid of Germany and is allied with Russia specifically in an anti-German capacity. Therefore, at this point, France also enters the war. 4 of the 6 major European powers are at war within a few days. I mentioned the 6 great powers because it had become customary to designate the main European countries in this way. And the 6 great powers were: the most important of all is Great Britain, which until recently was the largest industrial country in the world and still now rules over half the world. India and colonies everywhere, possessing the strongest navy in the world. It is no longer certain that it is the world's leading power because another has emerged, Germany, which has now surpassed England in industry and also in military strength. These are the 2 greatest powers. Then there is France, which is a major power that is somewhat smaller. Then there is Russia, whose true power is unknown to anyone because it is vast but poor and remains a mystery to all. Then there is Austria-Hungary, which is certainly weaker than the others, but it is still a great power. And then, by habit, Italy is also considered a great power, more than anything else because we care a lot about it. And so out of courtesy, Italy is regarded as one of the 6 great powers, but everyone knows it is the weakest. Then the largest, Great Britain, and the smallest, Italy, have remained out for the moment. Great Britain has no desire to fight this war over Sarajevo and informs the Germans that they are also willing to stay out, even though Great Britain is friends with France. However, this war is a matter, you know, in England, the spirit of Brexit occasionally resurfaces. It's a continental issue, you deal with it. Only England has one thing to ask of the Germans: you must not touch Belgium, because Belgium is a creation of English politics. And at that time, geography is even more important than it is now. Don't you think about where Belgium is across the Channel, in front of England, with its ports, Antwerp, which ensure the English connection with the continent no matter what happens. So the English say one thing to the Germans: we are staying out of your war, but leave Belgium alone. The German politicians summon the military and explain that this and that is fantastic. Great Britain is staying out, but we must leave Belgium alone. The German generals say, what a pity. Because we have a perfect plan to conquer France. It is a plan we have studied for 30 years. It is precise in every detail. In 3 weeks, we will be in Paris, guaranteed 100%, but it involves invading Belgium. Therefore, Germany invades Belgium, and when the German politicians ask the generals if the plan can be changed, the commander-in-chief of the army has a heart attack. Because everything is already ready. All the trains, all the schedules, all the plans, it cannot be done. Therefore, the Germans invade Belgium, and England also enters the war. 5 of the 6 major powers are at war. And the 6th, Italy, decides to stay out. Even though we were not involved in that game of alliances that led all the others to war, we too were compromised by an alliance. And we were allies of Germany and Austria. It was the Triple Alliance. It was an alliance that from a certain point of view was very unnatural. The alliance between Italy and Austria was one of the most extraordinary things in the politics of that era, because Italy had always considered Austria as its hereditary enemy. Generations of Italians had learned in school that the Austrian Empire was indeed the empire of the oppressors, the hangmen, the patriots, and yet we were their allies. And it was absurd for Austria to be allied with us because Austria had never accepted the unification of Italy, especially the Austrian military had never digested all those wars. The independence wars of the 19th century, in which the Italians lost all the battles at Custoza and Alissa, but in the end, thanks to our allies, we would win, and Austria had to cede a peace every time. The Austrian soldiers in 1914 were eager to take revenge on Italy. I mention an episode. Just a few years earlier, in 1908, the earthquake in Messina, which resulted in 100,000 deaths. Italy is on its knees. All the scarce resources of the army's fleet are engaged in rescue efforts. From all over the world, we are receiving solidarity and aid. American and Russian ships are arriving to help. In Vienna, the commander-in-chief of the Austrian army, Field Marshal Conrad, goes to see Emperor Franz Joseph and proposes to him, "Shall we declare war on Italy? We will never have another opportunity like this." Then they don't do it. But the atmosphere is that, so how is it that we are their allies? The fact is that even though Italy and Austria hate each other, both, we and they, want to be allies of Germany, because Germany is something else. Germany here, in Italy at the end of the 19th century, Germany is a highly admired country. Germany is everything. We want to become a great, modern, industrial, respected, and powerful country. We are undergoing the Industrial Revolution. Fiat was founded in 1899, and in those 15 years, the Italian industry has progressed. It is now present, weak, but it exists. And largely, this industrial revolution of ours has been financed by German investors. There are German industrialists working in Italy, and by the time World War I breaks out, it is already full of Italians working in Germany. Full. I take a small leap forward to a story that I will tell tomorrow morning, the Battle of Caporetto. At Caporetto, the Germans capture 300,000 Italian prisoners, and they remain astonished to see how easy it is, among all those Italians, to find someone who speaks German, because many of them worked in Germany before the war. And when they return from Germany, they say that the country works well. They pay well. Life is good. Germany is the future. However, this situation has changed a little in recent years, around 1914. Germany continues to be a country that we admire very much, and that is why we entered the Triple Alliance. However, in recent years, Germany, in addition to being admired, also begins to instill fear. Because the Germans seem not to know where to stop. They have built a formidable industry, becoming the world's leading industrial power. They have built a formidable army, the most powerful army in the world. As for the fleet, England still has a much stronger one. The Germans do not stop building battleships, and have explicitly proposed to become the strongest in the world, even with their fleet. And Germany, in the eyes of the public, is embodied by Kaiser Wilhelm, a character with a disturbed, arrogant, and insecure personality, who goes around threatening during any international crisis, raising his voice. His caricatures with the spiked helmet and bushy mustache are known to audiences all over the world. Germany is that, and it is frightening. Even in Italy. To give you an idea, I will read you a sentence from that time. An Italian journalist describes the German ambassador in Rome in 1914. The German ambassador in Rome, Mr. von Flotho, says our journalist, is a simple person, very courteous, of a fine and delicate type. and I would say almost decadent, absolutely different from the usual Teuton, now in the spotlight. He does not seem to be the representative of the most admired power, rather of a power that is fearfully admired. Do you understand what I mean? A good, mild, fine, delicate German, the reaction it provokes in Italy is to say he doesn't seem German at all. The German we are used to encountering is the Teuton with the spiked helmet, who makes us a bit afraid. With all this, when the assassination occurs in Sarajevo, in Italy, as well as in the rest of the world, no one imagines what is about to happen. Our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Marquis Antonino di San Giuliano, a Sicilian, goes to see the Prime Minister, Salandra Pugliese, to give him this news. In Sarajevo, they have killed Franz Ferdinand. And the comment from our Minister of Foreign Affairs, while giving the news to the Prime Minister, is so we have freed ourselves from that nuisance of Villa d'Este. What is the nuisance of Villa d'Este? Villa d'Este in Tivoli, a masterpiece of Renaissance architecture, was owned by Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Don't ask me why. He wanted to sell it to the Italian state, and the Italian state, for decency, could not back down. But the Archduke was asking for too much. 2 million lire. The Italian state did not have them and did not want to give them. However, it could not say no either, because how can we not repurchase a masterpiece of national art? As a result, when Franz Ferdinand is killed, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, private reaction is, oh, at least we've gotten rid of that nuisance of Villa d'Este. Of course, there are also other reactions because the Archduke was not loved in Italy. The Archduke was known as one of those from the party of revenge, connected to those military leaders who dreamed of teaching the Italians a lesson sooner or later, which is why the Italian public considered him a hostile figure. When he was assassinated, many celebrated. It seems that in a cinema in Rome, when the news of the assassination in Sarajevo arrives, they suspend the screening and the pianist begins to play the Royal March. That is the national anthem of our time. There was still silent cinema, of course, with a piano in the hall. Just to give you the picture, not a complete one, but a little more detail. When Franz Ferdinand is killed, it is not only in Italy that many say, well, he deserved it. Even in Austria-Hungary, there were those who hated him and found it to be a great thing that he was removed from the scene, particularly in Hungary. Do you know what Austria-Hungary was like at the time? They were two autonomous states, almost independent, sharing only a piece of the army and a foreign minister. For the rest, there was the Hungarian government, the Hungarian parliament, and the Austrian one. Archduke Franz Ferdinand wanted to transform the Austrian Empire, which was based on two dominant nationalities, the Germans and the Hungarians, into a three-legged system by creating a Slavic entity, a sort of Austro-Slavic Yugoslavia, thereby taking power away from the Hungarians. Therefore, the Hungarians hated Franz Ferdinand. There is a scene in a novel that many of us have read, The Radetzky March by Joseph Roth. It concludes with the news of the assassination in Sarajevo arriving at a remote garrison of the Austro-Hungarian army in Galicia. There, in the mess hall of a Hungarian cavalry regiment, when the news arrives that Franz Ferdinand has been assassinated, the Hungarian officers toast, shouting in Hungarian, "The pig is dead." This is how the world really works. Then one reads the epitaphs in the newspapers, on the tombstones, right? There you go. Good. Austria decides to accelerate the situation. For a moment, he wonders, could it be that Italy, since we are allies, joins the war alongside us? In reality, the Austrians know very well that it is not even worth considering. However, they do entertain the idea a little. As the crisis is exploding in July 1914, the Austrian ambassador in Rome, who is also a Hungarian noble, tells a journalist, well, yes, we will certainly end up going to war with Serbia, and perhaps it will lead to a world war, but you should come with us. I know we have fought a lot in the past, but this is really the opportunity to forget all the old grievances. Come with us. You will see that if Italy aligns with Austria, it is still the Austro-Hungarian ambassador in Rome who is speaking, and perhaps the French will not dare to enter the war. They will be frightened. To tell the truth, the ambassador's phrase is, if you enter the war, the French will be scared. After all, they are already full of fear, meaning they are scared out of their wits. For the series, The Refined Diplomatic Language of the Belle Époque. And then the Austro-Hungarian ambassador in Rome continues by saying, come with us, the war will be won, the German army will be in Paris in 3 weeks, and at that point, we will celebrate. The Italian interlocutor tells him, don't forget a small detail, England. And the Austrian ambassador replies, and what can England do? The Zeppelins, the German airships will take care of it, bombing London from the sky. And this will not be from Jules Verne. I wanted to read this to you to give you an idea of the mindset of that generation. Europe is governed by a generation of people who, as children, read the novels of Jules Verne, where all possible wonders existed. The submarine, the rocket to the moon, the super cannon, all things of science fiction. And then this generation has seen many of those things come to life. This is a generation intoxicated by technology and therefore by the sense of power, the overwhelming power that technology gives you. We have the train, the car, the truck, the airplane, the submarine, the super cannons, the super explosives. And in this intoxication, they enter the war one after another. And Italy must decide what to do. Now, I say Italy. But in reality, it is 3 men who have decided what to do. It is the first Prime Minister, Antonio Salandra, who is a completely ordinary Italian politician, who would not have gone down in history if he had not been there at that moment. He is a legal expert, like many Italian politicians, a university professor of law, and then he ventured into politics. He has been a minister several times, but he has been prime minister for the first time for 3 months. He has never done that job before. Then there is the foreign minister, the Marquis of San Giuliano, an old fox of politics. And then there is the king, Vittorio Emanuele III, the little king. Popular at the time, cautious. It is the 3 of them because the chamber is on vacation at that moment and it is not planned to call it back for the time being, so the decisions are made by the Prime Minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the King. And all 3 say no, even though we are allies of Austria. But honestly, entering the war alongside them is impossible. Austria has made a folly by unleashing this war, and we are staying out of it. The most repeated phrase in Roman political circles at that time is that if someone jumps out of a window, there is no reason for a friend to follow him. Of course, we would be allies of Austria, but no, even that. Just go read the treaty carefully, and indeed they are right. The Treaty of the Triple Alliance was made by politicians who knew very well that the Balkans are a powder keg. Because in the Balkans, everyone wants to expand. And in particular, both we and Austria want to extend our influence in the Balkans. And when they signed the Triple Alliance Treaty, they didn't just think it over. There is a clause that states each of the allies must consult the others before making any move in the Balkans. Austria has sent the ultimatum to Serbia, effectively forcing it into war without consulting us. Therefore, we are in no way obliged to enter the war, and everyone knows this, including the Germans and the Austrians. Therefore, King Vittorio Emanuele III writes to Kaiser Wilhelm explaining that Italy is not obliged to enter the war and that we would have preferred Austria not to have sparked this war. Nevertheless, since the war is happening, King Vittorio extends his best wishes to Germany, and it is signed, your ally is your brother. We know the reaction of Kaiser Wilhelm to this message from Vittorio Emanuele III because he noted it in his own handwriting in the margin, scoundrel. What nerve! After that, we are Italy. Generally speaking, we do not enter the war, but you never know. To the ambassadors in various European capitals, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs sends instructions stating that for now we remain out. But if someone were to offer us compensation, now that is still an era in which ambassadors hold significant power. Even though they already have the telephone and the telegraph, there is still the tradition of diplomacy where an ambassador who spends years in a capital speaks the language well and knows everyone. Indeed, engages in politics. The ambassador matters. And indeed, our ambassador in St. Petersburg immediately goes to the Russian foreign minister and tells him that Italy could also enter the war with you if you want. What do you offer? On the other hand, the ambassador in Berlin, Bolatti, who is pro-German, is generally someone who is sent to work in a country where he is a friend. The ambassador in Berlin is pro-German and has compromised himself significantly regarding the alliance between Italy and Germany. When he realizes that we, the alliance, are pretending that it doesn't exist and are not entering the war, our ambassador in Berlin is very upset. He feels that we are losing face. Therefore, he rushes to Rome. He goes to his boss, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Marquis of San Giuliano, and tells him that he will not return to Berlin under these conditions. Rather, he would commit suicide. Then the next day, he slightly changes his story and informs the minister that he will not return to Berlin. Instead, he will present a medical certificate. The Marquis of San Giuliano replies that if he really does not want to return to Berlin, the first option would be better. What are the reasons why the leaders of the country have decided that we cannot enter this war? The main one is the weakness of Italy. We all know that we are a second-rate power. It is primarily an economic weakness. I will mention just one fact to give you an idea, because we cannot imagine Italy's weakness compared to the other great powers. I will mention a fact: steel production, which at the time was the most important production, the one by which a country's power was measured. It was needed for making trains, but also battleships and armaments. For every ton of steel produced in Italy in 1914, Germany produces 19. England, 9. France. Going down the line, 5. And even Austria produces 3 tons of steel for every ton that Italy produces, which is 3 times as much. And the rest is the same. And this obviously also produces military weakness. The army is unprepared. It has no cannons, no reserves of ammunition. It has nothing. Therefore, we stay out by necessity. But there is also another perception among these politicians that drives them to say almost immediately, no, 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 we are staying out. And this perception is interesting. It is the impression that even though the war was born from an incident, the Germans were expecting it and wanted this war. They are determined to use it, to win it. The Germans are confident they will win the war, and they are resolved to use it to become the masters of the world. Salandra, the president of the council, makes it very clear in an interview with a journalist right from the start that this is an aggression aimed at establishing a crushing Teutonic hegemony over Europe and the world. And Salandra says we cannot become accomplices in this plot, especially because the worst consequences would be for us. If Germany dominates the world, it crushes everyone else, including us. You see, it is interesting. Twice in the first half of the 20th century, an Italian prime minister found himself in the same situation. Germany has unleashed a war, is confident of winning it, and wants to dominate the world. In 1914, Salandra says, therefore we certainly cannot help her. And 140, as you know, Mussolini will make exactly the opposite argument. It's just that it's not easy to stop there. Because once you've decided that you won't go to war, it's because if you did, you would have to enter alongside Austria and Germany. And you don't want to help them win. Because in reality, you don't want them to win at all. You are afraid they will win. But then the step is very short to say, but then let's help those others. It's not that we just stay out. Salandra also states this by January, perhaps already in December. In December, in an interview, the Prime Minister says we must hope that the Central Powers are defeated. It must no longer be possible for certain abnormal individuals, think of Kaiser Wilhelm, to plot such an attack against the peace, freedom, and well-being of the world. Germany is already seen and projected as the culprit that has unleashed this war. And Salandra says, just imagine if the German ambassador in Rome, who already walks around as if he were the master of the world, were to win this war. The result, however, is that we must prevent him from winning it. The commander of the army, Cadorna, who obviously responds to politics, prepared plans to enter the war alongside Germany when they told him they still did not know what was happening. There is a plan. We will send 5 army corps to the Rhine to help the Germans attack France. It is a plan and it sits there in the drawer. But already on September 18th, in a private letter, Cadorna writes, certainly, if Germany and Austria are defeated, it will be advantageous for us. Woe if they win, because then they would take revenge. And since our interest is to crush them, we must help others to crush them. It is easier to have these discussions in September than it was in August. Because in August it seemed that the Germans were really going to reach Paris. But they did not. The war has stopped. It has become trench warfare. Nothing is happening anymore on the Western Front. Do you remember Remarque's novel, All Quiet on the Western Front? Well, something is happening on the Eastern Front. Austria is taking a beating. The Russians are defeating the Austrians in a catastrophic manner. It almost seems like we are about to invade Hungary. At this point in Italy, part of public opinion is starting to think that it is time to show the Austrians what we really think of them. Interventionism is born, supported by many newspapers, including the most influential of all, the Corriere della Sera, directed by Luigi Albertini, who is an extremely influential journalist. I don't want to say he is a Scalfari of the time. Rather, he is more influential, with more connections, and more capable of influencing politics. Albertini pushes the Corriere della Sera towards propaganda for intervention. We must enter the war, but not with Austria and Germany against them. Interventionism is a complex phenomenon with many facets. Today, one might wonder how it was possible that amidst a slaughter like the one ongoing, there were people eager to send our own to be massacred. Today, it may seem incomprehensible, right? Yet there are many reasons. There was an interventionism that viewed Austria and Germany as the militaristic hanging empires of boots and spiked helmets, while the democratic Western powers fought for freedom and democracy. Furthermore, we must complete the Risorgimento by liberating Trento, Trieste, and so on from oppression. Keep in mind that the Germans, at the outbreak of the war, did nothing to erase this bad impression. On the contrary, in Belgium and France, they executed civilians, hanged people, and burned villages on a scale that recalls what they would later do in 1939-40 in Poland. And this news is obviously exaggerated by the propaganda of their opponents, the German atrocities in Belgium, the executions of civilians. All of this matters. The antipathy towards Germany is growing. And this is democratic interventionism. But there is also the futurist interventionism of intellectuals and poets like Marinetti, who dream of speed, power, weapons, technology, and believe that war is a beautiful thing because it must rejuvenate this country of mandolin players. The leader is Marinetti, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti. Listen to what Marinetti thinks. We want to glorify war, the only hygiene of the world. Militarism, patriotism, the noble ideas for which one dies, and the contempt for women. Furthermore, Marinetti states that war is the only deep rudder of the new aeroplane life that we are preparing. The intensified futurist war will kill pacifism. War is the culminating and perfect synthesis of progress. War will rejuvenate Italy, enrich it with men of action, and force it to live not from the past, the rough and sweet climate, but from its own national strengths. And here, futurism merges with the other current of interventionism, that of nationalism and imperialism. There is a whole movement that publishes in the newspapers, which is influenced by Darwin's theory, which was dominant at the time. The strongest wins. Only the fittest survive. Life is a continuous struggle. One must prevail. One must win. There are articles in nationalist newspapers that say, all this talk about the freedom of peoples, the fight against imperialism, is all nonsense. It is indeed necessary for us to wage this war, I quote. The war being fought today in Europe is not the war of pacifist democracy against military imperialism. It is a war of peoples and races for existence, for wealth, for dominance and supremacy. And what do we want by entering this war? We want war for the fulfillment of national unity. Fine, these are the talks of the Democrats, Trento, Trieste. We certainly wouldn't say no, but also especially listen to the list. For our dominance in the Adriatic, for our growth in the Mediterranean, for our influence in the Balkans, for our expansion in the Levant, for the legacy of Turkey in Anatolia, and above all, so that Italy participates today in the history of the world. In other words, if we stay out, we will count for nothing. We must enter and be among those who will win, crush the enemy, and seize the world. In the meantime, however, nothing has been decided, and the ambassadors of the Central Powers in Rome still hope that we will enter the war with them or not. But at this point, they only need us to stay out. Having understood the prevailing sentiment, the German ambassador and the Austrian one do everything they can to convince our government to remain outside. A journalist asks Salandra how the German ambassador and the Austrian one are behaving. Salandra replies with an angelic demeanor, they have become like lambs, ready to satisfy any issue. San Giuliano says that being the foreign minister in Italy has never been so pleasant, because all the foreign ambassadors come to court the foreign minister, of course. However, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Marquis of San Giuliano, is very ill and dies on October 16, 1914. In commemorating him in the chamber, Salandra, who has taken over the ministry, delivers a speech in which he states that the only criterion of Italian foreign policy must be the defense of our interests, the sacred egoism for Italy. This phrase from sacred egoism is picked up by the newspapers and creates quite a stir. Salandra is astonished. But what has he really said? That our foreign policy serves our own interests. However, it was rare for it to be stated so explicitly in that setting, that we are selfish and only care about our own interests. Almost immediately, Salandra must appoint a foreign minister. The last character who will decide on entering the war comes into the scene. It is Baron Sidney Sonnino. He is a very unusual Italian politician. While Salandra, a lawyer and professor from Puglia, is a classic Italian politician. Baron Sonnino is a very strange type. The father is a Tuscan Jew who has lived making business in Egypt. The mother is English, or rather, I believe, Welsh. And Baron Sonnino is Protestant, which for an Italian politician is already, how shall I put it, an unusual cocktail. Sonnino is convinced that one must go to war. He has formed his own idea, which the people are asking for. Then when they go to ask him, but the whole people, Sonnino says, but I know that it is the majority of the people in reality, but it is not the ignorant and the illiterate that matter. The majority is for pacifism, thus for a comfortable life. But if we believe that war is necessary for Italy, we must and will decide above the opinions of the crowd. Sonnino is convinced that the war must be fought because he has a strange reasoning. Sonnino believes that we cannot miss this opportunity to reclaim Trento and Trieste, and that if we lose it, the country will be left in turmoil, leading to a revolution and the fall of the monarchy. No one believes it, not even Vittorio Emanuele III, who says that Sonnino has blinders like horses. He sees only one thing in front of him, but Sonnino is convinced, and with this motivation, he pushes Salandra to enter the war against Austria and Germany. The interventionist movement is rampant in the country. New newspapers are being launched. Famous politicians suddenly change their minds. The most famous of those who suddenly changed their minds is Mussolini, of course, a leading figure of the Socialist Party who abruptly changes his stance, is expelled from the party, founds his newspaper, The People of Italy, and begins a fervent campaign to push Italy into war alongside France and England. There is an old rumor that we have all heard. He was paid by the French. Yes, of course, he was absolutely paid by the French. Mussolini. However, the situation is less unusual than one might think, because upon reading the chronicles of the time, it emerges that in Italy during 1914-15, it was perfectly normal for foreign embassies to pay journalists and also to pay politicians. And not only did they pay journalists, but they actually bought newspapers right before everyone's eyes. During those months, the German embassy purchased the Nation of Florence and plans to buy the Messenger. But then they do not buy the Messenger. However, it is done in broad daylight. And only a few far left or Republican newspapers publish articles stating that we are putting on a disgraceful show. There is a river of gold flowing into Rome to buy our newspapers, our journalists. We are for sale to the highest bidder. The interventionist campaign heavily involves the youth, the students. It is important. The students are few, very few compared to today, but they are the ruling class of tomorrow. And the students are massed for intervention, for the war. As a result, scenes occur that we would not imagine in Italy in 1914, but perhaps in other years we would. On December 9, 1914, at the Sapienza, the philologist Cesare De Lollis is scheduled to give a lecture. He is a great philologist and a close friend of Germany, who has long been publicly insulted in the newspapers as a traitor for being a friend of Germany. That day, the students violently prevent him from entering the classroom and giving the lesson. Instead, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti arrives in the classroom. He stands on the desk, rallies the crowd, inciting them to war against Germany, shouts, whistles, breaks the windows of the classroom. The rector of Sapienza arrives. We are in Rome at Sapienza. I don't know if I mentioned that. The rector of Sapienza comes and says to Marinetti, "You are profaning this desk." Marinetti replies, "I don't care." And one doesn't know if we are already in 22 or if we are already in 68. But in any case, these are things we would not have imagined in the Italy of the Belle Époque, and yet they happen in 14. What do the German ambassadors, especially the Austrian ones, do? They make promises. Or rather, the German makes promises, because we want Trento and Trieste. So it is Austria that must give in, and Austria does not listen to us. The Germans insist. We have then read the secret documents which show that Kaiser Wilhelm and his ministers are pressuring the Austrians by saying, "Promise Trento and Trieste to the Italians, please. And then at most, after the war, we won't give them to you. But in the meantime, promise her." The Vatican intervenes. The Vatican is very concerned that Italy remains neutral. The Vatican has a very strong relationship with Austria, a major Catholic power. A character who will be mentioned again later, Monsignor Pacelli, the future Pius Dutin, is sent by the Pope to Vienna on a mission, convincing the old emperor to at least cede Trento. The old emperor does not listen. The Germans are changing the ambassador in Rome, Mr. von Flotow. Do you remember him? That delicate, kind one who doesn't even seem like a German? He is not suitable for the occasion. They send a heavyweight, Prince Bülow, who has already been Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of the Reich, and who is a great supporter of Italy. He has married a Sicilian princess. Bülow sets up in the German embassy in Rome, begins to spend money, buy journalists, and make promises. The Italians ask him, "But what about Trento?" Bülow replies, "I'm working on it, but you know how the Austrians are. Why don't we promise you instead?" And in fact, they promise him. He arrives with the list of promises: Nice, Savoy, Corsica, Tunisia. All things that do not belong to them, and consequently. But the Italians are stubborn. They want Trento. At a certain point, Kaiser Franz Joseph is convinced halfway. It is discovered that Trentino was actually made up of a county and a bishopric in the Middle Ages. The county is a fief of the emperor, and he does not want to cede it, but perhaps he would consider the bishopric of Trento. When the Austrian ambassador goes to tell these things to our government, they are at their wits' end. He says these people still conduct diplomacy based on feudalism and heraldic consultation. Nothing. The Italian government has decided on war by January. The only thing is that since we are not ready, we need to drag things out a bit. Therefore, the government, note how it worked. I don't want to say democracy, but there was universal suffrage as the parliamentary Italy of that time functioned. The government summons the journalists one by one and explains what it expects from them. Salandra, president of the council, tells the director of the Tribuna, in essence, to start preparing public opinion, but without exaggerating, because we are not yet sure. For now, it is best that the press conducts itself with caution and does not incite or depress. It is advisable, as is done in country inns with pasta and rice, to keep public opinion at half-cooked. The half-cooked public opinion means yes, maybe, but in the meantime, let's negotiate with the Allies. We have made our decision. Negotiations are opening in London. A list of demands has arrived from Rome. To enter the war alongside you, we want Trentino, but not only that. We also want South Tyrol at this point. Not just Trento, but also Bolzano up to the Brenner, Trieste, Venezia Giulia, Istria, Dalmatia with its islands, Vlore in Albania, and the coal basin of Adalia in Turkey. One of the main English politicians of the time, Lloyd George, will write in his memoirs, "None of us bothered to find out exactly what Italy wanted. We said yes to everything." Come on, we have just a little bit left. I will go a bit over time, but just a little, I promise. On April 26th, the London Pact is signed, committing Italy to enter the war within a month. Remember the dates, April 26th. And we will enter the war on May 24th. The last article of the London Pact states that this agreement will be kept secret. Only Salandra, Sonnino, and the king know about it. The king sends telegrams to the King of England and to the Tsar of Russia, saying, "Congratulations, now we are allies. We are about to enter the war at your side." After signing the London Pact, a small detail comes to Salandra, Sonnino, and the king's mind. It is not clear whether they had the authority to do this. Why did they sign it? Parliament knows nothing. Parliament is on vacation. It suspended its work in March and is set to reopen on May 12th. And Parliament, they go to see what the statute says. Sonnino says, fantastic, the statute says that the king has the power to declare war. We're all set. However, the statute also states that the chamber must then confirm the war credits and the full powers to the government. Therefore, the confirmation of the chamber is required, and the chamber is actually mostly neutralist. Here I must introduce a new character, the last one I hope to introduce. So far we have not mentioned him at all, but he is the stone guest. For all of them, it was an obsession. So far he has not appeared. Giolitti, who had been the master of Italian politics for 10 years, 15 years. A figure who had greatly influenced Italian politics and who had resigned in March 14 due to a minor parliamentary crisis. One of those cases where a government says, well, it's better to have a bit of alternation. I'll resign for a while. I'll put someone in who doesn't count for anything. Who shall we put? Salandra. I, Giolitti, will stay out for a while. And then I will return. I control both the parliament, and it is true, Giolitti has control over the majority of the parliamentarians. Giolitti, I don't want to waste your time, but he has been a protagonist of Italian history on a grand scale. He governed for many years, and obviously many began to hate him. His political opponents, and even those from his own party. The hatred towards the right-wing bourgeoisie because Giolitti authorized strikes, labor chambers, and granted universal suffrage. But he is also hated by many progressives because Giolitti made agreements with the unions in the north, but in the south, as denounced by Gaetano Salvemini, a prominent southern Italian, in a book published during those years, titled The Minister of the Underworld, Giolitti governs with squads, with beatings, with the police that imprison opponents, with unimaginable things that make one want to tear their hair out when reading Salvemini's book about what was happening during elections in Italy in the early years. Therefore, Giolitti is extremely hated, and now, due to a mistake of his own, he is not in power. However, now Giolitti and his associates begin to sense something, even though the London Pact is secret. The preparations are visible, and the deputies start to become agitated. The chamber is closed. It will reopen on May 12th. The deputies are already in Rome at the beginning of May. Montecitorio is physically open, and the deputies come and go. The government on May 7th prudently postpones the opening. Instead of the 12th, we will open on the 20th. At this point, the situation deteriorates. Giolitti realizes that the government is deceiving him because they tell him, no, nothing has been decided yet. Giolitti understands that he has been misled. To a journalist, he says, I'm sorry to say this about Salandra. It was all a deception from a person from Puglia. However, Giolitti rushes to Rome, and on May 9th, the government is terrified to the point that it organizes spontaneous demonstrations, in quotation marks, against Giolitti at the train station in Turin when he departs, and at the train station in Rome when he arrives. This is also a staggering thing, reflecting how politics was conducted in that Italy. Malagodi, a great journalist and director of the Tribuna, writes in his diary, Giolitti has arrived, against whom demonstrations have been organized, in agreement with the Ministry of the Interior and the police during his departure from Turin and upon his arrival in Rome. Do you understand what this means? After that, Giolitti is beside himself. Giolitti's statement to the journalists, the people who have the government deserve to be shot. They want to lead Italy into war for no reason. And Giolitti insists, we cannot go to war. Italy is too weak. One of his arguments is very interesting. He says, guys, I have governed all these years. We fought the Libyan war. Only I know what our army is like. I always had to falsify the reports of the clashes in Libya to avoid showing that victories only occurred when it was 10 against 1. Giolitti said to a journalist, the generals are worth little. They have stepped out of line when they sent the sons of the more foolish families into the army, of whom they did not know what to do. Finally, we are so poor that we cannot afford a war. Giolitti arrives in Rome on May 9th, and on May 10th, 300 deputies and more than 100 senators stop by his house to leave their visiting cards. What it means is that I agree with him, and therefore the majority of the chamber is against the declaration of war. At this point, there is panic because the government discovers that in the meantime it has already signed the alliance, and the king has already sent telegrams to his colleagues. So an attempt is made to contain the damage. Salandra says, all right, I resign. It's the only thing I can do. The king replies, yes, and what about me? Do I have to abdicate? Here there is truly something fabulous because King Vittorio Emanuele III, in those days, tells his prime minister and also Giolitti the following things. First, yes, I have compromised myself. I have sent telegrams to my colleagues, the King of England, the Tsar. I have compromised myself. I must abdicate. And that's perfectly fine. The king will make my cousin, the Duke of Aosta, do it. He likes it. He enjoys all these ceremonies that deeply annoy me. Then he says, the king, that he is ready to leave, that he has always thought he would like to live in the Balearic Islands or in Antibes, and that he really didn't care at all. Again, says the king and his ministers, I perhaps would not have come here at the Quirinale that is at the royal palace, and I wanted to talk about it with my father. But he died in that way, and I was forced to come. You know, Umberto, I was assassinated in Monza, and Vittorio 15 years later. Vittorio says, or tries to make his ministers believe, that he would have preferred to let it go. Then, the government resigns. The king threatens to abdicate. The Vatican decides that it is time to push. He sends envoys from the Catholic ministers to tell them that this is the last opportunity to avoid war. To make the terms of the discussions clear, Monsignor Boncompagni Ludovici goes to a minister and tells him that the war must be avoided. The war is unjust. Only that, quote, traitor Jew Sonino wants it. The Pope informs the king that if he insists a little more, Austria is ready to concede everything, including Gorizia. The whole world knows that this psychodrama is happening in Rome, where Kaiser Wilhelm, Emperor Franz Joseph, their prime minister and their chiefs of staff meet on May 9th at the Austrian Supreme Command. And there it is decided that the Austrians will promise everything the Italians want. The Austrians have us put it on record, but then after the war, we will take everything back. And here, we need to understand what is happening because it is something almost incomprehensible. It is the final act of this drama. Within a few days, the country, and particularly Rome, is overwhelmed by street demonstrations. And the demonstrations in the square are all for the war, because the ministry allows the war demonstrations to take place while the police beat and disperse the neutralist ones. Therefore, squares are full of people demonstrating for the war. Who is demonstrating for the war? Bourgeoisie, employees. In Rome, employees from all ministries are in the square demonstrating. The students who believe in it are convinced. The demonstrations rage with impressive violence. One of the protagonists is not true that I have finished. There is still one more, but you all know him, Gabriele D'Annunzio. Gabriele D'Annunzio, the most famous literary writer in the country, returns triumphantly to Italy after years of voluntary exile in France to avoid paying his debts on May 5th at Quarto dei Mille. A grand demonstration for intervention in the war is held. Then he stays a few days in Genoa. He leaves behind, as revealed by parliamentary discussions of the time, an astronomical hotel bill for himself and two of his lady friends, which he leaves for the municipality of Genoa to pay. He goes to Rome, and upon arriving in Rome, he addresses the crowd. And these speeches are of an impressive violence. Then there will be very little afterwards with brief excerpts from the great speech. Comrades, it is no longer time to talk but to act. It is no longer time for speeches but for actions, and Roman actions. If it is considered a crime to incite citizens to violence, I will take pride in this crime. In your Rome, there is an attempt to strangle the homeland, the neutralists, with a Prussian noose handled by that old executioner with the thick lips. Giolitti had a protruding lower lip, as seen in all the caricatures, and he, who Gabriele D'Annunzio publicly calls that old executioner with the big lip in the capital, whose fleeing heels know the way to Berlin. If he wins, here there will be a reason to be ashamed of being Italian. To call oneself Italian will be a name to hide, a name that will burn the lips. This wants to make us that lamenting sycophant of filthy Prussian feet. After that, there was an announcement saying, however, do not be afraid because there is a system to stop them. This band of slaves, of servants of the enemy, with this lowly servitude, fears blows, is afraid of beatings, is terrified of corporal punishment. I commend them to you. I wish I could say, I hand them over to you. The most skilled among you will be highly deserving of the city and public health. As a result, the aggressions multiply. The beatings of Giolitian deputies occur. Giolitti's house on Via Cavour is attacked. Students demonstrate in front of Montecitorio, and at one point, they invade Montecitorio. Under these conditions, the government is resigning, and the king seeks someone to take on the role, asking Giolitti. Giolitti, perhaps mistakenly, who knows, says no. No one else wants to do it. On May 16th, the king reassigns the task to Salandra and sends him back to the chamber. And the chamber, which on May 10th had a majority for peace, on May 20th votes for the powers granted to the government for the war. What happened to each individual deputy who changed their mind? It would be nice to see what happened to them during those days. The fact is that the chamber changed its mind and the country went to war. How we will fight this war and how we will win it will be told tomorrow. However, I wanted to conclude here with a kind of nemesis. The London Pact, signed on April 26th, had as a clause that it must be kept secret. But in 1917, there is the revolution in Russia. In October, the Bolsheviks take power. And by rummaging through the drawers of the ministries, they find the London Pact and publish it immediately to show the world what the diplomacy of capitalist countries is and what ideals they are fighting for. We want the Brenner, Istria, Dalmatia, Turkey, Albania. That's it. This stuff is being published all over the world by Lenin. It's a shame that by that point, our true allies are no longer Russia, which has collapsed, or England and France. Another player has entered the scene, and that is the United States. The United States is President Wilson. The United States is winning the war and will win it. Without them, it would not have been won so easily. The United States are the masters of the world from an economic standpoint. They control all the taps, the grain, the oil. And the President of the United States, Wilson, is determined to end this war without giving satisfaction to all those greedy plunderers who claim to have this and that. President Wilson clearly stated to the world that he would not truly succeed in his aim, but at that moment, his line is freedom for peoples, self-determination, no conquests, no grab and run. When they show him the London Pact, President Wilson points out that the United States has not signed anything. They were not there at the time, and therefore are not in any way obliged to give Italy all those nice things that others had promised. As a result of the peace conference, we will be forced to swallow bitter pills, and every single thing from those promises that we managed to obtain will be imposed from above. We will not be able to have everything, and the country, which is already battered by the war, will begin to feel the effects of D'Annunzio speaking of a mutilated victory. In short, many things will happen that you already know. This is like saying the ultimate fruit of that secret diplomacy that made the London Pact. But precisely how we will arrive at this outcome, we will tell tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I apologize for the somewhat unusual time and the early wake-up on a Sunday, but this is how it went this year. So, yesterday we recounted how the decision to enter the war was made by the highest political authorities in Italy on May 24th, 1915. Today we will tell the story of what was the most important battle from a certain point of view of the entire war, and certainly the most famous, the most remembered, and that, due to a typically Italian paradox, within a war that we ultimately won, is nonetheless a lost battle, Caporetto. In fact, then, in a huge summary, I will touch upon the entire course of our war up to that point, because to understand a battle, one must know the context in which it is situated. A battle is like a moment in a long speech. A war is a long speech. You fight, you retort. And the battle is a remark. It is a moment. It has meaning within a more general progression. And the meaning of Caporetto is that it contradicts everything that our World War I had been up to that point. Caporetto, you know, is an Italian defeat. During an attack that the enemy is mounting on our front. Now we lost at Caporetto, also, among many reasons, also because we were not used to being attacked. We always fought in World War I by attacking. And here there is a very precise logic. In war, the forces involved are rarely equal, as in a game of chess, and therefore, there is a balance that can only be broken by the skill of one of the two. In war, it is almost never like that. Wars are asymmetric. There is almost always one side that is stronger and one that is weaker, and usually the stronger side attacks, while the weaker side tries to defend itself. Now the Kingdom of Italy, were certainly weaker compared to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Last night I quoted some figures. Although the Austro-Hungarian Empire was the weakest of the great European powers, apart from us, for every ton of steel that Italy produced, the Austro-Hungarian Empire produced 3. Germany produced 19. But let's not go there. Nevertheless, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was stronger, more populous, and more industrialized than us. However, we enter the war in May 1915, at a time when Austria has already been at war for 10 months. And during those 10 months, it has suffered some terrifying defeats. Austria is the country that triggered the war by attacking Serbia to punish it for its complicity in the Sarajevo assassination. The other powers entered the war one after another. Austria is at war against Serbia in the Balkans and against Russia, in Galicia, in Poland. And in those first 10 months of war, Austria suffers devastating defeats both against the Serbs in the Balkans and especially against the Russians in Galicia. The pre-war Austrian army is almost annihilated. The majority of Austrian officers in service at the beginning of the war were either killed, captured, or wounded in those first 10 months of World War I. No one can provide precise figures on the losses. Whenever you see exact numbers for World War I, know that they are not true. No one really knows in detail how many died, how many were injured, how many people disappeared forever. Even the European bureaucracy of that time, which was meticulous and very attentive, was worse than our current one. It was a bureaucracy capable of counting how many chickens were in a farmer's coop. But even the bureaucracy of that time could not keep track of the men thrown into the furnace and who disappeared. That said, by rough estimate, the Austro-Hungarian army lost 1 million men in the first 10 months of the war. When we talk about losses, we do not mean just deaths. Losses always refer to the dead, the wounded, and the prisoners. The dead are a minority. Yet that army has had to remove 1 million men from its roles and is still fighting on 2 fronts. And we enter the war and open a 3rd front for them. Therefore, we are objectively stronger at that moment. The bulk of the Austro-Hungarian forces are and will always remain until 1918, until the Russian Revolution, on the Eastern Front and in the Balkans. At the beginning, the Austrians have nothing against us. And even afterwards, they will always struggle immensely to put the minimum number of men necessary in the trenches, to try to defend themselves. We have more men, more cannons, more ammunition, more airplanes, more to eat. Therefore, we attack. We enter World War I with the belief that by entering, everything will collapse. Austria is already on the brink, fighting on 2 fronts. How can it hold out? If we enter, it will collapse. Within a few months, in fact, within a few weeks, we will go to Trieste. Within a few months to Zagreb, to Ljubljana, and by the end of the year to Vienna. And we will put an end to World War I. And instead, as you know, it doesn't go that way. But not because we haven't attacked. We do attack. You know how the front line is. The border is continuous. But there are only two areas where fighting can take place, because the rest is high mountains. And in the high mountains, battles are fought pro forma. There are impressive feats with the Alpine troops. But in reality, the real war is fought where the roads and railways reach, where you can bring hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of cannons. The real war can only be fought in Trentino. And in front of Trieste, and our Supreme Command, Cadorna, decides from the very beginning that even the Trentino is too narrow. There is not enough space to advance. Therefore, we will remain stationary in the Trentino. We attack towards Trieste. Attacking towards Trieste means attacking along the Isonzo, which roughly runs along the old border. It's about crossing the Isonzo, taking some mountains, capturing the Carso Plateau, and behind the Carso is Trieste. Just a few kilometers away. It seems very easy. As you know, we would never get there until the end of the war. But not because we didn't try. Caporetto will be on October 24th, 1917. In the 2.5 years leading up to Caporetto, Cadorna continuously attacks on the Isonzo, 11 battles of the Isonzo. The 12th will be Caporetto. The very fact that they are all called battles of the Isonzo shows you that not much progress was being made. They continued to push there. Every now and then we make some progress, taking 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers of ground, a small hill, another one. A great victory in 16, we take Gorizia. After trying for 1.5 years, we finally take Gorizia. A few kilometers later, we start fighting again. However, we are always the ones attacking. Before Caporetto, the Austrians attacked our front only once, compared to 11 offensives by Cadorna on the Isonzo. They attack only once in the spring of 16 in Trentino. They attack because the Austrian commander and Field Marshal Conrad is so eager to take revenge on those traitorous Italians who were our allies in the Triple Alliance and then entered the war against us, that even though the empire is on the brink, Conrad manages to convince the politicians to provide him with the resources, means, cannons, and men to attempt an attack. They try it once. And that offensive in the Trentino in May of 16, which the newspapers immediately dubbed the punitive expedition, the Strafe expedition, to punish the Italian traitors, and our command expects so little, that those beggars from Austria could attack us, that they are completely caught by surprise. In May 1916, the Austrians broke through in the Trentino, overwhelming our lines. They were then halted by an enormous effort from the entire army, the commands that managed the situation well, and of course the troops, who fought like they had never fought before in those places that now bear the names of our streets and squares: Pasubio, the Asiago Plateau, Passo Buole. They were stopped by a hair's breadth as they were very close to reaching Vicenza. After that, it was the only time they attacked. Then we started attacking again, and they spent everything they had in that one attempt. We are always doing better. The system is functioning better and better. The industry in Italy is growing. Our allies are helping us. In the spring of 17, the United States enters the war, and a flood of supplies arrives. We are doing well. The Austrians are doing worse and worse. In fact, to put it bluntly, this is perhaps a lesser-known aspect of World War I. Austria is an empire that is literally dying of hunger. It no longer has any access going to the sea. It only has Trieste left. But the Adriatic is in the hands of our fleet, the French fleet. Nothing can pass through, and nothing arrives from outside into Austria, or even into Germany. Things are not well in Germany either. In Germany, the winter of 16 to 17 is remembered by the collective memory of the Germans as the winter of turnips, because that was what there was to eat: cabbage and turnips. But Germany is powerful, strong, solid, and keeps moving forward. Austria, which is a step below, is dying of hunger. There are testimonies from the officers who go on leave to Vienna and say, "Good heavens, what faces the people have." And the soldiers in the trenches have nothing to eat. And we attack, and the Austrians resist despite everything. Here, the fact that they resist so stubbornly deserves to be explained. There are at least two reasons. One is that in reality, World War I is a war that favors the defenders. You know, it's not always the same thing. It depends on what weapons are available. There are times when the available armaments help the attackers. Think about World War II with tanks. That advance and break through everything. In World War I, it is the opposite. What are the new weapons? The machine gun. The machine gun doubles the capacity of defenders in a trench. You have 100 rifles defending 200 meters of front, but if you also have a machine gun, it's as if you had double. The technological innovations are the machine gun, barbed wire, and the trench. In World War I, to attack means to assault an enemy who may be 300 or 400 meters away, but is in a trench. You can't even see them. And you are also in a trench. When it's time to attack, you go out. You have to run across those 400, 500 meters that are, however, filled with barbed wire, while the others are shooting at you. In World War I, all offensives are extremely costly, resulting in a huge number of deaths and injuries, and they either fail or achieve minimal results. This is also the case on our front, but there is also another motivation. It is that the Austrians believe in this war against the Italians. The war against the Russians matters little to the Austrian officers. There is no particular hatred towards them, and the fighting is taking place in the empire's poorest provinces, Galicia, which in reality means nothing to anyone. The Austrian officers joke that whoever loses the war gets Galicia. But on our front, it's another matter. There is Trento, and especially Trieste, the only true port of the empire. And there is another issue. There is Italian imperialism that wants to assert itself, which has clearly stated from the very purpose of the war that we want to go to the Brenner. And we want Istria, Dalmatia, we want to expand into the Balkans. And the local populations know this in Trentino. We attack little or nothing. But if we had attacked, we would have faced Tyrolean Kaiserjäger regiments recruited locally, who knew very well that they were fighting to defend their homes. And on the Isonzo, the units that resist, you know the Austrian army is an army where 10 languages are spoken. But on the Isonzo, there are Slovenian and Croatian units who are also fighting because from their point of view, Gorizia is their city, Trieste is their city, Istria is theirs. And they do not want the Italians to come back to rule over their home, as they did for so many centuries during the time of the Venetians. Thus, the Austrian army, starving and outnumbered, resists desperately. And we move forward a little bit at a time. However, we move forward a little. And in August 1917, the 11th Battle of the Isonzo is considered a victory by the standards of the time, a clear victory. Let's move forward on the Bainsisa Plateau beyond Gorizia. Let's advance for 8 to 10 kilometers. Which seems like a huge distance by the standards of World War I. And in August of 17, Caporetto will be on October 24th. In that August of 17, we advance on the Baisisa. Then, slowly, as always, the offensive wears out. The losses are too many, and the Austrians manage once again to plug the gap. But for the last time, the Austrian command realizes that they have run out of everything. There is no more man to add. Therefore, to the Austrian command, while the Italian offensive in August is still ongoing, it is said that this time we can hold on. But if Cadorna attacks again this autumn, it will be over. They break through. The Italians go to Trieste. And if the Italians go to Trieste, the empire collapses. There is too much symbolic value as well as economic. Therefore, the Austrian commanders say to themselves that something absolutely must be done. We cannot stand still and wait for Cadorna to attack again. And Testardo Comè will surely attack this autumn. It seems that the Italians never run out of ammunition or men. Therefore, the Austrian command says we must do something ourselves, we must attack. We need to push them back at least a little. We need to gain some space, some breathing room. We need to attack ourselves. But they absolutely do not have the means to do so. You understand, in those conditions, with the trench, the machine gun, the barbed wire, and then we will talk about the cannons and the airplanes in those conditions to attack you. must at least be stronger at the point you have chosen to attack. At least at one point, you must be double, triple, otherwise you will never succeed. And the Austrians absolutely do not have the means to do so. But they have their older brother, the Germans. Germany of the Reich, as they used to say, of the Second Reich, Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm. They have the Allies, and decide with great effort and embarrassment to go and ask for help from the Allies, the Germans. With great effort and embarrassment. One sometimes naively imagines that in war, the Allies care for each other and are happy to help one another, just like in politics. It's not true at all. The Allies hate each other. They are forced to stay together but have divergent interests and would be happy to see the other collapse, as long as they are not involved. Moreover, the alliance with the Germans is a hard pill to swallow. The Germans are modern, strong, wealthy, powerful, and look down on the Austrians. This is one of the most embarrassing things, to tell the truth, because we and the Austrians are on the same level. Do you understand? We are two countries suspended between modernity and backwardness. Both we and Austria have a heavy industry. We have Turin, Milan, Genoa, while they have Vienna, Prague, and Budapest. However, both countries have a large rural hinterland, very poor and backward, with illiteracy rates much higher than those in France, Germany, and England. We are countries that are half modern and half backward, the two weakest among the great powers. For us, the Austrian army is a formidable opponent. We have hit our noses 11 times despite everything. And for the Austrians, we are also a formidable opponent. The Austrians have great respect for the Italian army, its artillery, and the stubbornness of Cadorna, who continues to attack. We are on the same level. Instead, the Germans, when they look at the Austrians, say, and they say it and write it right. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to tell you. The German generals of the Austrian army think of these primitive Balkan people as clumsy, backward, and fatalistic like the Turks. They can't organize anything and are always saying, well, let's hope for the best. The Austrians know that the Germans think this of them. And the Austrians think of the Germans as these know-it-alls, masters of the world. And they hate having to get along with them. Even worse, having to go cap in hand to ask, please, give us a hand. However, by the end of August, the Austrians are in such dire straits that they go to ask the Germans for help. The other embarrassing thing is the reaction of the German generals, because the German generals respond to the Austrians. But why should we waste resources on an insignificant front like the Italian one? The war in Italy is of no importance. Whatever happens, we have more important things to do. The Austrians insist, saying, perhaps you don't understand. Look, if they take Trieste, a revolution will break out in the empire. Everything will collapse. At this point, the Germans think it over a bit, and the commander-in-chief of the German army, Field Marshal von Hindenburg, who is very old, remembers that when he was a child, another great war, the Crimean War, ended with the fall of a port, Sevastopol. The Allies had taken Sevastopol, and Russia had surrendered. And Hindenburg says, well, we understand. With Austria, the same thing could happen. Trieste is too important. We must help them. By the way, just to add a couple of brush strokes to the character, Field Marshal von Hindenburg was already very old enough to remember the Crimean War, and he would live for a long time yet. In Germany, between the two wars, he will become president of the Weimar Republic. Despite being a convinced monarchist nostalgic for the Kaiser, but the Germans still make him president, and he will still have time in 1934 to appoint a chancellor of the Reich, a gentleman with a mustache, who has just won the elections. But let's go back to 1917. Hindenburg and his main collaborator, the great strategist of the German army, Ludendorff, say to each other, all right, we need to lend a hand to these unfortunate Austrians. We might be able to save some forces for the moment. However, we need to see if this makes sense. The Austrians arrived with a plan. They studied the front and identified where the right point to attack would be. Here you must imagine this front that descends from the mountains along the Isonzo towards the sea, towards the Adriatic, in front of Trieste. The entire Italian army is massed down low by the sea and on the karst, because we want to go to Trieste, and we attack there on the karst where there is space. Further up, it is all mountains. It's not worth gathering large forces. We are not interested in pushing there. At the beginning of the war, we pushed a bit, yes. In the early days of the war, the Alpini took a mountain, Black Mountain. A song was even made. So great was the enthusiasm for this capture of Black Mountain. They stopped there. Well, nothing is happening there. Our troops are all further down. There is just a thin veil of troops there to hold the trench line. There's really nothing to be afraid of. The Austrians aren't attacking us. We are always the ones attacking. There, under Black Mountain, there is also a Slovenian village, which at the time was a Slovenian village called Kobarid. And it is still a Slovenian village called Kobarid. It's just that on May 24th, the Bersaglieri entered and changed its name. It was called Caporetto. After that, a small Italian school was opened to teach the children of the Slovenian mountain dwellers who are now Italian subjects. And we are there. We are there to stay. We will win the war anyway. However, in that sector, we have almost nothing, very little. Why is that? The Austrians have seen all this. They go to the Germans and say, look over there. Do you see Caporetto? Caporetto. Yes, there is Black Mountain in front full of Alpine troops, but there are passages to attack from the sides. We are not going to attack Black Mountain. Let's go down into the valley. If you arrive at Caporetto, you can see on the map that the roads and valleys intersect there. And just south of Caporetto opens a beautiful valley called the Val Natisone that descends quietly. In an instant, you are in the Italian plain. In an instant, you are in Cividale. In 2 days, you are in Udine, where Cadorna's supreme command is, which seems to the Italians to be the safest place in the world. Even Caporetto actually seems to them to be the safest place in the world. If you get there, in an instant, you descend into the plain and take them from behind. And the Austrians say, when we break through there, Cadorna will see that the bulk of his army, gathered further south, risks being taken from behind, so he will have to retreat. The Italians will have to fall back a bit. The Germans say, so you would like to push them back a little? Yes, say the Austrians, at least to the old border, that is, the territory they took after May 24th, there on the watershed. The Germans say, if we move, we do not do it for so little. If we come, we will push the Italians back so far that they won't be able to stop until they encounter at least a large river to take cover behind. What is the first large river they find? Go. Here is the Tagliamento. If we come, we will push them at least to the Tagliamento. The Austrian generals respond, you will never get there. Never. The Germans say, let's see. But first we need to take a look. We haven't promised anything yet. We need to see what this front you are talking about is really like. So they call in an experienced German general in mountain warfare, a Bavarian, General Kraft von Dellmensingen, and send him to take a look. General Kraft spends a few days touring the trenches in the Caporetto sector with the Austrian officers who show him everything, wearing an Austrian cap to avoid raising suspicion among the Italians. He then makes a phone call and says, it is very difficult, but it can be done. The Italians have very strong positions, mountains full of cannons, positions that seem impregnable. But there are the Italians after all, says General Kraft. In my opinion, we Germans, not the Austrians, but we Germans can make it. And here begins what has seemed to me, I must say, the most extraordinary phase of this entire story, namely the planning of an offensive from the German general staff. Because it's fine, you made a political decision, you see. In war, many nice ideas come to you. You would like to do a lot of nice things. But you can hardly do anything because the resources are what they are. If you do one thing, you can't do others. Therefore, the decision to allocate resources to the Italian front is a political decision made at the highest level, the supreme command, the Kaiser. All right, let's do it. What are we giving to the Austrians? 6 divisions is what we can spare. 6 divisions means about 150,000 men, give or take. The Austrians say, could you give us 8? The Germans reply, no, we have 6. You will see that it will be enough. All right, at this point you have mentioned it, and you have also identified the 6 divisions that are currently resting, and that may also be more experienced in mountain warfare. So you have already decided which divisions will go there. What happens next? And from Berlin, they call a good general who is in France, commanding an army, a Prussian, General von Below, and they say to him, dear, come to Berlin because we need to talk to you. General von Below goes to Berlin, to the immense building of the Great General Staff, which no longer exists today, having been razed to the ground by American bombings during World War II. However, more or less in the same place is Merkel's chancellery. At the palace of the Great General Staff, which the German military colloquially calls the Große Bude, the big barracks. He goes to hear what they want to tell him. And they say, look, we have decided to attack Italy to help the Austrians. We will organize a new army, 6 divisions, and you will command it. We have assigned you a chief of staff, General Kraft von der Menzingen, who has already been there to see. An expert in cannons, an expert in airplanes, an expert in trains, an expert in fuel. Meet with them and prepare the plan for this offensive. We are at the beginning of September. General von Below asks, but by when do we need to do it? Immediately. Let's say by mid-October at the latest, because then it snows there. You have no idea what those places are like. 2 days later, General von Below is in a hotel in Vienna with his collaborators, spreading maps on the table and starting to think, we need to bring 6 divisions there. What does it mean to bring them there? The railways come close, but not even close enough. The closest stations, yes, there are some small stations. Villach, Klagenfurt, Ljubljana are the closest. From there, the troops, once they disembark from the trains, will still have to march for a week in the mountains, just to reach the starting positions. 2 only roads, 2 passes at 1,000 meters. Go up, go down. It will take a week. In the meantime, let's take them to those 3 little stations. 6 divisions are being sent, 1 to Romania, 1 to the Carpathians, 1 to Ukraine, 1 to Poland, and 2 are in France. From the 4 corners of Europe, they must be brought to those 3 little stations by train, of course. 150,000 men, 5,000 cannons. And to pull the cannons, 30,000 horses, along with 2 million artillery shells, each weighing an average of half a quintal. And all this stuff needs to be transported by train from the 4 corners of Europe to those 3 little stations in the coming weeks. Therefore, it is a German general staff one sits down and studies. It's no coincidence that there is a train expert. We refer to the railway schedule for these movements. Do you know how many trains are needed to transport all that stuff to those 3 small provincial stations? 2,400 trains, 100,000 railway cars to load and unload. And they manage in just a few days the railway schedule for 2,400 trains that will bring all those people and all that stuff to those 3 small stations. The Germans set the schedules and the trains move at the right time, gradually arriving to unload the troops. Of course, the schedules were made by the Germans, but the trains are Austrian, so the problems start right away. Every now and then, a train gets lost. At a certain point, the Austrians also collaborate, and they are bringing in troops and cannons using other trains as well. At one point, the Austrians make a phone call. Unfortunately, there are 2 batteries of super heavy cannons essential for the offensive, and we don't know where they have ended up. We need to call all the stations of the empire. Then they ended up in Transylvania. They are going back. The Germans take note. I think we won't make it by mid-October. But anyway, we will try. The supplies arrive, and then all these troops land in these small stations, spend a few days resting, receive special training for mountain warfare, and get new weapons. Because they are Germans, nothing is forgotten in the preparations. When they are ready, they set off on the famous week of marching in the mountains, just the last week before launching the attack. Since there are only 2 roads, movement on the roads is also planned as if it were a railway. Along the roads, there are the German officers with lamps, the schedules. The battalions depart at a certain time and arrive at a certain time. Only in this way is it possible to get almost everything through. Naturally, this is the perspective of the general staff, who remain in their offices. The troops that march for a week in the mountains. Oh, I forgot, only at night. The entire march is conducted only at night, because during the day the Italians fly, and we do not want them to see what is coming. This night march, we also have reports from the units that undertook it, a terrifying march with soldiers cursing the commands and wondering who the madman was that sent them up into the high mountains at night. There is already snow up high. It is a dreadful march on a road full of wrecked trucks because the trucks continuously go off the road, tumbling down into the ravine. Horses, mules go down into the ravine, and men go down. They scream, but no one hears them. There is such a noise from the streams and the storm, yet almost everything gets through. You know that war is that situation in which if you need to bring 100 men to a certain place and 99 arrive, 1 is dead. It has gone very well, perfectly. There is not the slightest problem. They arrive. They wanted to attack on October 15th at first, but then they postponed it by a week to October 22nd. The day before, the Austrians called, saying they were not ready yet. The gas shells for the artillery have not arrived. At this point, the Germans send a general to the Austrian command to check. He returns and says, "You can't imagine how hard they are working. They ran out of gas." The Germans lend gasoline to the Austrians, but the Austrians say they still need 2 more days and it's fine for October 24th, but not beyond. On October 24th it begins. Everything is ready. 6 German divisions, several Austrian divisions, 300,000 men, 5,000 cannons. The plans are precise, starting with a gas bombardment at 2 in the morning on October 24th, followed by 4 hours of gas bombardment, then explosive bombardment, a few hours of bombardment, fast, and then the attack. Each unit has its orders, its schedules. Planning means this, that up to that moment, as long as you could, you must have thought of everything. Then, when the battle begins, the conversation changes. It's not that you delude yourself into thinking you can plan it. You don't know what will happen. A real army like the Germans knows very well that at that point, anything can happen. We must be ready for anything. Planning is only valid until the last minute. They are therefore ready to attack that night of October 24th. They have done everything possible in secret. The German officers who went on reconnaissance in the trenches disguised themselves as Austrians. The troops marched only at night. They spread disinformation, transmitting news about German units in Trentino. They have done everything to keep this matter secret, and our commands know everything. We know absolutely everything. Every detail, the times, the attack plans, everything. And we know everything for at least 2 reasons. You see, something like this is actually an illusion to keep it hidden. Hundreds of thousands of men involved, the railways of the entire empire. How can you keep it hidden? The Austrian soldiers in the trenches are the first, even though no one has told them anything, but they are the first to understand everything. You know that it is a phenomenon that has been observed since the First World War. Soldiers always mysteriously know everything. There are the telephone operators, the cooks, the official mess waiters. The soldiers know everything. The Austrian soldiers know it very well. That they will soon send them into the attack and that it will be a big deal. How do they know it? There is an Austrian artilleryman at his battery. When a neighbor from Prague comes to him and says, "Do you know that a battery of German cannons has arrived nearby?" He replies, "Germans, are you sure?" Yes, I spoke to them. They are Germans." At that point, the first reaction of the Austrian soldiers is to go to the Germans to beg for something to eat, because the Germans are doing well while the Austrians are dying of hunger. Then indeed, in the rations of the Austrian soldiers, at a certain point, a slice of bacon appears. 20 grams of bacon. Months without seeing anything. Months of potatoes, cabbages and turnips is bacon coming. It means something, say the soldiers. Then they distribute the steel helmets. Austria is poor. They used to distribute them sparingly. Now all those trains, carloads of steel helmets to the troops in the trenches. And then they distribute the green postcard. And that is always the signal that a battle is about to begin. The green postcard is the army's free postcard from Austria. You can go see it. It's available on the internet. There are images if you want. It is the green postcard that soldiers can send home via military mail, and it is designed for illiterates. So the same phrase is written in 9 languages. I am healthy and everything is fine. And this is written in German, Hungarian, Polish, Romanian, Italian, Serbo-Croatian, Ukrainian, etc. When they distribute it, the soldiers know that they are being sent into the attack. And everything that Austrian soldiers know, our soldiers know as well. First, because there are phone interceptions. There are already devices that, planted in the ground, allow you to hear what those others are saying on the phone in the trenches 100, 200, 300 meters away. And behind there are offices with officers who know the languages, who are there 24 hours a day transcribing everything that is said on the phone from the other side. Everyone knows this. We do it. They do it. Both our soldiers and the Austrian soldiers, when they talk on the phone, speak in dialect if they can. They hope that those on the other end do not understand. In fact, everything is understood. And since the beginning of September, we have been intercepting Austrian officers who say, have you heard that the offensive is being prepared? Did you hear that the Germans are coming? Did you hear that it will be in mid-October? Did you hear that it will be in Caporetto? There you go. And then there are the deserters. The deserters are those who can no longer take it, and one fine night decide that they are done. For them, the war is over. It is better to fall into captivity. Therefore, they leave secretly, crossing no man's land to surrender. There are countless deserters. During World War I, soldiers desert continuously every day. Do you understand how it is? There are millions of men in the trenches who are living like dogs, eating very poorly, and risking their lives every day. Therefore, every night there are people who flee. Our soldiers desert, and the Austrian soldiers desert as well. But the Austrian soldiers desert more than ours. First, because our soldiers eat poorly, but they are starving. And secondly, because the Austrians are not all Tyroleans or Slovenians, who despite the entire war against Italy understand it and fight because they know very well that if they lose, the Italians will come to take command in their home, as will indeed happen promptly at the end of the war. But there are also nationalities that do not care at all about the war on the Isonzo, Romanians, Czechoslovaks, Poles. They don't care at all. They are nationalities where many actually hope to lose the war. Here, the Austrian army has fought for 4 years in the war against an army where some of the officers and soldiers hope to lose. Thus, we will have an independent Czechoslovakia. We will have Serbia joining Croatia. We will create Yugoslavia. And therefore, a lot of people, including officers who belong to those nationalities, desert. In the last days, before Caporetto, Austrian officers of Romanian, Polish, and Czech nationality arrive, bringing the orders from their units about when the bombardment will start and when the attack will begin. Our side knows everything. Indeed, the order has reached all units for 2 days. On the night of October 24th, the attack begins. It starts at 2 o'clock with a gas bombardment. Therefore, at 1:30, all the troops were awake and wearing gas masks. And Cadorna, who at first did not believe much in this story that they wanted to attack us because it seemed so crazy to him. The Austrians are so weak, that's fine. The Germans are coming, but what will it matter? We have never experienced them. At that point, we delude ourselves into thinking that we are so strong, that the Germans will make no difference to us. Our generals say so. If they say it among themselves and tell the troops, guys, the Germans are coming, all right? You don't really think it's better than the Austrians. The Germans will come very well. We will take new prisoners that we didn't have before. And we will send them to Milan to show them to the people, the German prisoners. And then Cadorna says, anyway, can you imagine if they attack in October? After mid-October, it's already snowing. Until the last days, despite the reports that come in. And say all the things I have told you, Cadorna continues to believe it only halfway. Even in the last days, officers hear him say that the situation is manageable. However, Cadorna is a professional. If we have time, we will talk a bit about him. But we won't have time. But anyway, he is a professional full of character flaws, with some backwardness, but also with his own modernities, an intelligent man, a man of first quality and reality. Cadorna, even though he believes little in it, does his job. They will attack in that sector of Caporetto, and we should deploy more troops. There were few, it's true, at the beginning, but when the attack begins, we have many more troops, because Cadorna has taken countless brigades that were resting and transferred them to that sector. Therefore, Cadorna is calm. They will break their teeth. And instead, as you know, everything happens the opposite. The Germans break through. Where the Austrians attack, we stop them almost everywhere. But where the Germans attack, they pass through like butter. Our lines in front of the Germans collapse. The reserves amassed behind disintegrate. Within 2 days, it is clear that they will descend into the plain. Within 3 days, Cadorna must evacuate Udine and transfer the supreme command to Padova. Within 3 days, Cadorna must order the entire army to retreat. It is clearly the hardest decision of his life. However, he must make it, because if we stay where we are on the Carso, they will take us from behind. Then it will be over. We must save the army. Even this order to retreat is hard for us to imagine what it meant. It is a shock from which the Italian army cannot recover for a moment. Do you understand what it means to retreat? Retreating means the Germans had calculated correctly, retreating all the way to the Tagliamento. Because if we start to go backward, with troops retreating pursued by the victorious enemy, it's not like you can stop wherever you want. You have to turn around and fight. Before an army that is retreating can regroup and find the courage to fight again, it must have strong support. From the terrain, a great river is needed, no doubt about it. Therefore, the order to retreat, given on the 3rd day by Cadorna, is a retreat to the Tagliamento. This means that the Italian army abandons all the territory it has conquered in 2.5 years of war, which has cost 500,000 lives. I'm talking about the dead this time. Forget it, let's abandon everything. Not only that, let's go even further back, to Italy. I found the diary of an officer who was not involved in the Caporetto area, because the Caporetto attack only involves a fairly small part of our army. The bulk is further down in the Carso. They know nothing. A colleague suddenly arrives and says, "Don't tell anyone, but it seems that there is an order to retreat. We're leaving this afternoon." He says to retreat, but how far? Are we going back all the way to the Isonzo, which already seemed like a lot? He says, no, retreat to the Tagliamento. And the officer says to his colleague, "But the Tagliamento is in Italy, and there are 100 kilometers. Are you going crazy?" Here, the bulk of the Italian army receives this order like a bolt from the blue, an incomprehensible order. However, it is necessary to retreat, and it soon becomes clear that a retreat is underway because the enemy has broken through and is advancing. So, the Battle of Caporetto is a day or two of fighting on those positions that are breached, followed by 2 weeks of retreat. Pursued by the enemy, stopping to fight whenever possible and almost always losing these encounters, and then retreating again. And it is there that a lost battle becomes a national catastrophe. Caporetto, I will now try to give you an idea of the magnitude of the catastrophe of Caporetto. It is not because we lost 40,000 dead and wounded, because we would lose 40,000 dead and wounded in any of our offensives on the Isonzo. It was a completely normal thing. The commands were neither hot nor cold. But we lost 300,000 prisoners during the retreat. As those others arrive, they capture people who were not able to escape quickly enough. In the end, they will have captured 300,000 prisoners. Now, 300,000 prisoners is already another figure. There is one more zero, 1% of the Italian population. One Italian in 100 was taken prisoner at Caporetto, including women and children. That's 1 in 100. Of these 300,000 prisoners, many will not return home, because imprisonment during the First World War is a terrifying experience. especially imprisonment in a country that is starving like Austria. The camp, which they already call that, is one of the most famous, and will become even more famous with Nazism, Mauthausen. The camps are already places where people die, even if there are no SS, no gas chambers, and no one wants the prisoners to die. However, there is nothing to eat. Austrian civilians are dying of hunger. Just imagine what it is like for the Italian prisoners. Therefore, the Italian prisoners are dying of hunger, typhus, and Spanish flu in 1918. Not only has our army lost 40,000 dead and wounded, and unfortunately 300,000 prisoners, which is already a significant blow, but the fact is that of the 1 million men who are retreating, more than half are no longer soldiers. They are stragglers. Stragglers is a term that comes into use among journalists at that time. There is nothing else being talked about. The stragglers are the soldiers who are retreating home and have thrown away their rifles, no longer obeying the officers. They walk because the idea is to return home. The war is over. We have lost. And who cares if we have lost? The important thing is that it is over. The majority of Italian soldiers during those weeks are convinced that the war is over. And many observers, journalists, officers, and politicians note that they are almost happy, carefree, and calm. It went badly, but patience, they are going home. They sing, "Goodbye, my beautiful, goodbye, I will make peace." When they are a bit embittered, passing by the officers, they look them in the face and say, "The Camorra is over." Because for the soldiers in the trenches, the war was that. The Camorra, the cook who gave the most generous rations to his friends, the shirkers who never risked their skin, the friends of the commander who took, "There you go." And we are dying in the trenches, the Camorra, the Carabinieri, who eat better than others because they help. The generals execute people, the Camorra. Now the Camorra is over. So this army, during those weeks, seems to be falling apart. And this army is retreating into a terrifying landscape where everything is burning. Burn everything because we set fire to everything. The order is to set fire to everything so as not to leave anything for the enemy. On the first day of the retreat, our soldiers, who had been eating poorly in the trenches, discover that just behind them our foresighted bureaucracy has set up immense depots filled with millions of cans of American canned meat. They are our allies. They entered the war and send us supplies. Cans of salmon. The Americans produced a tide of salmon. Our soldiers would go in and eat the salmon. Or rather, it remained in the warehouses waiting. Barrels of liquor, flasks of wine, new uniforms, linens, shoes, everything. There is everything. And the order is to set fire to it. The soldiers set fire to everything. But first they go in. Fill their backpacks, fill their bellies, break open the barrels of liquor, walk around with flasks hanging, get completely drunk, and most of them will make the entire retreat drunk. Enter the warehouses, take everything and set it on fire. Set the warehouses on fire, set the towns on fire, the railways, the stations, the locomotives, higher orders, everything is burned. And when the military warehouses are emptied, they begin to enter the shops, private stores, and homes. The retreating soldiers loot everything. Udine, Pordenone, the farms, the countryside, everywhere. The soldiers march continuously with full bellies for the first time in a long while, drunk, taking whatever they want impunely, almost always impunely, because then it is a lottery. The craziest thing is that if you are very unlucky, you turn the corner and there is a checkpoint of carabinieri with a crazed officer searching those who pass by. If you entered a house, found a pair of women's stockings in a drawer, and put them in your pocket to take them to your girlfriend, they find them, slam you against the wall, and shoot you. But the vast majority do not encounter the carabinieri and continue to march like this, drunk, singing, and not in the midst of the fire that burns everything everywhere. There are the immense parks of cattle that subsistence has prepared to feed the people. Now they must be liquidated, leaving nothing for the Germans, eliminating them all. But there is no time to shoot each bull in the head. No, they are all enclosed in pens. Gasoline is spread. They are set on fire with the animals still alive. And we continue to march through all of this. And among the soldiers, there are civilians. Because civilians do not stay at home waiting for the enemy. To tell the truth, at the beginning, the prefects were ordered to post beautiful posters that said, "No panic, the situation is under control." But the people saw that the gentlemen, those who are well informed, were loading their belongings onto carriages or into cars. We are suspended between the 19th century and modernity. Some already have a Fiat, while others still have horse-drawn carriages. The gentlemen loaded their things and left. Then the people also began to leave. With great difficulty, think about the situation. It is the end of October. The farmers have their harvests in the warehouses, the cellars full, the livestock fattened, everything ready for winter. And we have to leave. In every family there are discussions. The grandfather says, I will stay, and many stay while many leave. 500,000 refugees are leaving along this road towards the Tagliamento, mixed in with the troops. It is continuously pouring rain. These people have nothing to eat. They march, they march, they march. Many officers, I have found more than one, recall in their books the thing that struck me the most during the retreat. The peasant woman, barefoot, walking for I don't know how many days, dazed with the newborn at her breast, and the newborn was dead, and she hadn't even noticed it yet. It is raining continuously, fortunately, because when it doesn't rain, German planes come down to strafe, and these mixed columns of stragglers, of soldiers who still have their rifles and stop to fight, those who still obey orders and stop to fight, are the ones who are then taken prisoner and end up in the camps. The others flee. All of this lasts for 2 weeks. Towards the Tagliamento first. And the bridges over the Tagliamento are very few. And there is an immense crowd arriving, and at a certain point no one can move forward. At one point all the roads are blocked. Then the order is to clear all vehicles. The military units up to that point brought their trucks, their cannons, which were extremely expensive, sometimes pulling them by hand. Now we can no longer move forward. The order is to get rid of everything, throw everything into the ditches, along the roads, the cannons, the trucks, overloaded with stuff. The horse-drawn carts, there are thousands of them, overloaded with stuff. The hospital equipment, the medicines, the crates of the regiments, the archives, the paperwork, endless paperwork, everything must go. A few days later, the correspondents from the German newspapers will arrive, following their troops, and they will write in their newspapers that billions of items are scattered on the streets of Veneto. Billions in a very poor country like Italy. You throw everything away, the trucks, the horse-drawn carts, even here. You don't stop to detach the horses, not even for a moment. You leave them there to die. The Germans will arrive 2 or 3 days later and will find kilometers and kilometers of roads surrounded by thousands of carts with horses that have died of hunger while gnawing on their harnesses. And they march through all of this, and when there is a dead horse, the soldiers stop, and with their bayonets they take a piece of meat. At least there is something to eat. A dead horse, many say, also has a live horse, of course. And we arrive at the bridges over the Tagliamento, and there truly we cannot move forward any longer. The bridges are overloaded with people, military and civilians, and we cannot move either forward or backward. And at a certain point on the other side of the bridges, there is a captain of engineers with a megaphone who says that in half an hour the bridge will blow up. We will blow it up ourselves. We won't let the Germans who are coming take it. We have to defend ourselves behind the Tagliamento. In a quarter of an hour, the bridge will blow up. In 5 minutes, in 2 minutes, and the people are there, unable to move either forward or backward. Then all the bridges over the Tagliamento explode, overloaded with people, soldiers, civilians, women, children. They all blow up. And behind the Tagliamento, a sigh of relief is drawn. Perhaps we will stop here. But then the news arrives that the Germans further north have also crossed the Tagliamento, and so we must start moving back again. And finally, we stop at the Piave. Behind the Piave, when the Germans arrive, they are so out of breath, so tired from running after and fighting and capturing prisoners and stuffing themselves, because the Germans and the Austrians are everywhere. They devour everything they find, kill the remaining pigs, and eat them raw. Many farmers tell the parish priest that there is a German dead in the cellar. He came there, broke open the barrels, got drunk, and drowned in the wine. Upon reaching the Piave, the Germans can no longer continue. They stop by the skin of our teeth. We managed to hold our position. The rout of Caporetto is over. We lost 40,000 dead and wounded, 300,000 prisoners. At this point, the stragglers start to recover a bit because they realize that the war is not over, that there are still officers, that there are still carabinieri. And so gradually the stragglers, who had been confined in huge concentration camps, are slowly put back into uniform, and the army gradually reforms. But those 300,000 are in the camps, starving to death. There are 500,000 civilian refugees that the government will have to support until the end of the war. And it manages, with some difficulty, to distribute them throughout Italy. Each municipality takes in a few. Then there are those who remain there because some of the civilians stayed behind, those who were unable to cross the Tagliamento, those who decided not to flee. A piece of Italy, all of the Italian Friuli and a part of Veneto up to the Piave, remains under enemy occupation for a year. That is, under the occupation of an army, brutalized by 3 years of war, which hates the Italians and is starving. You can imagine what that year of occupation was like. The mortality rates of the population that remained are staggering due to hunger, diseases, and rapes. We have many diaries from the priests that recount what is happening in their villages, with the Germans and Austrians taking away everything there is to eat, everything. The bells from the bell towers taken down to make cannons. In short, it is in this sense, as I was saying, that Caporetto is not just a lost battle, but a national tragedy. It is a national catastrophe. And it is a national catastrophe that leaves many scars that are difficult to heal. We conclude with this. As in every national catastrophe, the hunt for the guilty parties immediately begins, questioning who is to blame. There is the testimony of a priest, a friend of the Supreme Command, who, along with the famous Father Gemelli, who would later become the founder of the Catholic University, was fleeing from Udine, the headquarters of the Supreme Command, in a vehicle loaded with nuns. I am on the street, among the refugees, among the lost, in the midst of this crowd that is walking in the same direction as the car, covered in mud. They see a deputy, the deputy from Tolmezzo, Honorable Gortani. Tolmezzo is in that area. It will fall into enemy hands in those days. The deputy from Tolmezzo, recognizing these influential priests, friends of the Supreme Command, shouts at him from the machine. On the ground, covered in mud. Now we will shoot your Cadorna. So on one hand, there are these sentiments. It's the general's fault. We need to understand the mistakes they made, dismiss them, punish them. The mood in the country is that a captain, Captain Marpecati, who would later become an important fascist leader and at that time was a university student, was on leave from Florence. He returned to the front, and the next time he came home on leave, after Caporetto, his mother asked him, "Is our army really that disgusting?" In the newspapers and in parliamentary debates, the speeches suggested that we believed we had a great army and great generals. In this climate of widespread distrust, what blame do the generals bear? We want to know. It was a great national tragedy. What does one do in Italy when there is a great national tragedy? A parliamentary inquiry commission is appointed. And the parliamentary inquiry commission does its job and holds many generals accountable for their responsibilities. Cadorna made enormous mistakes. Others did as well. Since I know that some of you are curious about this, because there is always someone who thinks about it, I will tell you, yes, it is true. Badoglio also had significant responsibilities, and the inquiry commission decides to let it go regarding him because Badoglio has made a career. He is an indispensable man. It is better not to touch him. There is nothing very mysterious or secretive. These are things that happen every day, of course. But the point is that the generals refuse to say, yes, it is our fault. The generals are not willing to do that at all. And on the very day he gave the order to retreat, knowing full well that it was the most insane order of his life, and not wanting to take the blame himself, Cadorna published a bulletin from the Supreme Command in which he stated that he was forced to give the order to retreat because of certain units of the army, not all. And he mentioned army units that had cowardly fled or had shamefully surrendered without fighting. This thing never happened in those terms, although in reality the collapse of the army at Caporetto was immense. But it never really happened in those terms. Yet the world reads Cadorna's bulletin. To tell the truth, the government in Rome, when it sees this bulletin, puts its hands in its hair. I mean, do you understand what that means? Our supreme commander who accuses our soldiers of cowardice. It cannot be. The bulletin is censored, but in the meantime it has already been transmitted abroad. And the whole world will remember, as those passionate about the history of the First World War still remember it now. In America, in England, in Australia, if you mention Caporetto, they say, oh yes, that place where those cowards, the Italians, ran away, That is a scar that is no longer closed. But above all, the problem is that the military, when put on trial, convinces themselves that the blame lies with everyone except them. It is the soldiers' fault for being cowardly, but the soldiers are cowardly because the country is rotten. The country is rotten because it is full of Reds, of socialists who are propagandizing against the war. All this pacifist rot, the socialist deputies who speak in parliament saying the war must end. What a shame. The generals convince themselves that the country is rotten, that it needs a good cleansing, and that it is the fault of the politicians, of liberal politics, of the parliament, that things have degenerated. To that point, therefore, Caporetto is also the moment when a part of the Italian ruling class, the military, becomes convinced that the system is rotten, that parliamentary democracy does not work, that the Italian people. There are several letters from officers during that period that say, I am sorry to say, but the Italian people need 100 years of a stick. And as you know, the stick will come, even if it won't last 100 years. But that is the moment when many military figures and many right-wing intellectuals become convinced that Italy must change course. And when the road actually changes, those people will be convinced that, finally. I will conclude with this. General Cadorna exchanged letters with General Kraft von Dellmensingen in the post-war period of 1925. What a wonderful thing this is, that at the end of the war, the enemy soldiers, the enemy generals begin to chat like good friends, sharing stories. And Cadorna wrote to General Kraft von Dellmensingen in 1925 that the disaster of Caporetto would not have been possible if Italy had already had the strong current government. The strong government in 1925 is Mussolini, following the Matteotti murder. And Mussolini has just enacted the fascist laws and has definitively transformed his government into a dictatorship. Cadorna applauds. If only we had already had Mussolini in 1917. And this is indeed another scar that I couldn't say is still somewhat open now, but certainly in those post-war years in Italy, it had consequences. Thank you. This evening, we conclude this trilogy on Italy's World War I, recounting the last year of the war from Caporetto to Vittorio Veneto. I must be honest from the start, it is a story less surreal compared to that of Italy's entry into the war, and less tragic than the story of Caporetto. Anyway, you are here now. It is a piece of Italy's history that I believe is worth examining a bit more closely. After Caporetto, therefore, the Austrian and especially German attack began on October 24th, 1917. Within 2 weeks, what remains of the Italian army has been pushed back to the Piave. Just to be clear, in a war where victories were measured in kilometers, 1 kilometer at a time, in a war where the 11th Battle of the Isonzo, which we won, the Battle of Bainsisa, led the Italian army to advance by 8 to 10 kilometers. Those 8 to 10 kilometers of advance gave the Austrian commands the feeling that next time everything would collapse. The Germans at Caporetto pushed us back by 150 kilometers. We are in Italy. A part of Italy is occupied. The columns of Italian prisoners marching eastward cross paths with the columns of Germans moving forward. Their bellies full because they have stopped to eat everywhere. Enthusiastic, happy for the victory. When it rains, with umbrellas open, because the German columns loot the umbrellas from the houses and, for a while, march sheltering themselves with the umbrellas until their commanders decide that it is not suitable for real men and therefore prohibit it. The Germans cross paths with our prisoners and jokingly say to them, in Milan, we are going to Milan. Then, every now and then, some Italian officer in captivity finds himself having a chat with an Austrian officer who speaks Italian, an Austrian officer who might be from Trieste, and who tells him, as I found in a memoir, now, we are going to Rome to catch the little hunchback, where the little hunchback would naturally be King Vittorio. And instead, they do not go to Milan and they do not go to Rome. They stop at the Piave. The first question that always arises in these cases is precisely, why did they stop at the Piave? How did the Italian army manage to halt there? Here, the answers are actually many, as always. When someone asks why something happened, there is never just one reason. There are many. The historian's temptation would be to ask, have you ever had examples in history of a victory after which the victors conquer the whole world? No. You always come to a stop. Sooner or later, when you have won, you stop. Stopping at the Piave after 150 kilometers of running is the least. The Germans are exhausted. They left all their artillery behind. It takes time to bring it forward. The airports, the warehouses, the railway lines, everything is left behind. And the troops are overwhelmed, exhausted. They can't go on any longer. Arriving at the Piave and Grappa in that November of 17, they try again. They still hope. But there they do not pass. What remains of the Italian army holds firm. And it is the first sensation suddenly in Italy that perhaps after all, not everything is lost. The army, despite the blows it has taken, is still there and still fighting. In fact, to put it bluntly, it fights better than before. Because what remains of the army is now fighting in Italy. And it is easier to explain to the soldiers why they are fighting. Certainly, even before soldiers spoke of the homeland, the Risorgimento, the unification of Italy, Trento, Trieste, the fact is that the Italian troops who were attacked and overwhelmed at Caporetto had been living for 2 years in a foreign country, inhabited by Slovenian foreigners who detested them and rightly considered them invaders. And our soldiers were not very happy. Now, however, we are fighting in Italy. And our propaganda understands this immediately. This is what we need to focus on. We need to explain it to the soldiers, and it's not difficult. Look, not everyone has left over there. Certainly 500,000 refugees have left from the territories beyond the Piave. But many have remained, and our propaganda to the soldiers insists on saying this. Think of those who have stayed on the other side. Think of the women. You can hear the women shouting, and they can hear some of it for real and some of it they imagine. However, the idea that it is worth resisting on the Piave is easier to convey, and the soldiers fight better than before.
Then there are also other reasons. We must not underestimate the fact that our allies have come down to lend us a hand. It's not that they care about us, but the danger of Italy exiting the war, of the enemy actually reaching Milan, is just too great. Therefore, the English and the French have sent us troops. By the end of November, to be clear, there are 11 English and French divisions deployed on the Italian front. 11 divisions, which is more than the entire Third Army. During the retreat, we celebrated the Third Army commanded by the Duke of Aosta, which, while the Second Army was routed at Caporetto, returned intact and undefeated. Then for decades, the rhetoric will celebrate in Italy the undefeated Third Army. The 11 divisions sent by our allies alone are more than the entire Third Army. And it's not just that. It must also be said that the English and the French have superior quality armies. The English and the French have been fighting for 3 years in France against the best army in the world, the Germans. When we faced the Germans, we crumbled at Caporetto. The English and the French have been holding their ground for 3 years now, although it must be said with great difficulty. They are different armies, they have a different level of professionalism and different resources, with other economies backing them. Even before Caporetto, we had English artillery batteries sent symbolically out of friendship to our front. And the English artillery officers, in their diaries and books, say, that the Italian army's soldiers are incredibly brave. It's crazy how the soldiers, the young officers, go to get themselves killed. However, in terms of technique and competence, there is little. The artillery has many cannons, but it does little. And they have few resources. Normal fire for an Italian battery means firing 6 rounds per hour. For an English battery, it means firing 30 rounds per hour. And the difference is noticeable. There is a different tactical competence, different armaments. The Austrians notice it. The Austrians are used to fighting against us, and they match us evenly. But in December, on Mount Tomba, the Austrians find themselves facing the French, and the French tear them to pieces. Thus, the help from the English and the French is substantial, significant, and is assisting our army, which is actually getting back on its feet. The stragglers gathered in enormous concentration camps are gradually being organized. They take up their rifles, are assigned to units, and the units go into the line and fight. After that, of course, our historiography has always emphasized the fact that after the disaster of Caporetto, we learned something. The command has changed. The style of command has changed. Cadorna is gone. Now there is Diaz. And if you go to see in the dissemination, in the manuals, there is a strong emphasis on the more humane way of commanding that Diaz would have brought with him. Greater understanding for the soldiers, for their mentality, more leaves, more distractions, fewer executions. So it is partly true. Diaz personally has little to do with it, probably. Who is Diaz? It is often said that they appointed an unknown person, to everyone's great surprise. This is quite true. Let's be clear. Armando Diaz is not an unknown figure to his colleagues. He is a corps commander. And still, His Excellency Lieutenant General Armando Diaz, there will be 30 or 40 like him in the army. That's too many for the public to know them. They mention it when they explain it to the Allies. King Vittorio, for example, explains to the Allies, to the English and the French, that we have this Diaz. He is excellent. He is the best. We have appointed him. The real truth is probably that they put him in place because they didn't want to risk someone more important, as they weren't very sure how it would turn out. There could have been the Duke of Aosta, the commander of the Third Army, cousin of the king. But giving the supreme command to the Duke of Aosta at a time when we don't know if everything is going to end very badly, Cadorna has already been burned. Are we going to burn another one? King Vittorio, who often returned to this theme without imagining that many years later it would actually happen to him, said, well, if things go badly and I have to abdicate, it's better that my cousin is ready. So we won't put him in command of the army. We'll put someone in charge who, even if everything goes wrong and we've burned Diaz, will be patient. Then Diaz, along with his collaborators, including, it pains me to say, Badoglio, who bears significant responsibility for Caporetto, manages to give a strong impetus for modernization to the Italian army as the Deputy Chief of Staff. And also, because the Inquiry Commission on Caporetto does not touch upon him, Badoglio, as he has become a valuable man. Diaz and Badoglio change many things. What changes, for example? The way of doing propaganda with the soldiers. That propaganda should be done with the soldiers because what the soldiers think is important. Cadorna would have said, but why do soldiers think? Just imagine 1 million illiterates. Instead, the soldiers think and feel. The new commanders understand this better. Therefore, propaganda needs to be made. Not that propaganda wasn't done before, but before Caporetto, someone had started to understand it. This idea that we need to organize speeches and conferences for the soldiers was already circulating a bit before Caporetto. However, if one looks at how it was actually implemented in practice, let me tell you how it was carried out. One of the divisions that is overwhelmed at Caporetto, the 50th Division. Just a few days before the enemy offensive, the general commanding the 50th Division in Conca di Plezzo suddenly wakes up. He is an old gentleman. Suddenly he wakes up and says, oh, right, the conference has been held. Yes, General, they tell him, don't worry, the conference has been held. The conference consisted of this. A room like this, full of Alpine soldiers. The speaker is a captain of the Bersaglieri, over 70 years old. A veteran of the Third War of Independence, wounded at Custozza. A great patriot who re-enlisted at the outbreak of the war. He is a captain of the Bersaglieri. And at 70 years old, they don't know what to have him do. So now there is this new thing of conferences, and they have him give the conferences. So in a room full of Alpine soldiers, the veteran of Custozza, leaning on his crutch as a disabled veteran, gives a conference on the theme, "It is beautiful to die for the homeland." I also found the report from the commander of those Alpine troops, which states that the hall was noisy. Now, propaganda is starting to be taken seriously. The peace service, propaganda is established in the Italian army, and the propaganda is carried out by the best intellectuals available in the field. Many are enlisted, including Prezzolini, Salvemini, Piero Calamandrei, Ardengo Soffici, writers, poets, and all kinds of intellectuals, capable people, who take this matter seriously and understand that you need to speak to soldiers in a certain way. You have to tell them simple things. On the other side, there are the women. We will go to liberate them sooner or later. Magazines for soldiers are born, some are famous, and today collectors have their shelves filled with them. The translation, well-made magazines, not just throwaway stuff. The translation is collaborated on by journalists from the Corriere della Sera, which also includes the illustrators, from the Sunday of the Courier and the Courier of the Little Ones. One could write a book on how the Courier of the Little Ones has shaped generations of Italian bourgeois. And then it emphasizes that soldiers need to be treated better. They must eat better. Before Caporetto, they were eating like dogs. And during the retreat, they discovered that it was full of warehouses, overflowing with all kinds of goods. And they had to set everything on fire to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. It must not happen again. Good supplies must reach the soldiers in the trenches and then send them on leave. Before, they were sent as little as possible. Because Cadorna was convinced that the soldier who goes on leave arrives in the village. And in the village they tell him, when will this war end? Enough, let's make a revolution. And the soldier returns to the front and no longer wants to fight. This is Cadorna's obsession, so we do not send them on leave. Now, however, they are sent on leave much more often. And rest must be true rest, not gymnastics, effort, or drills. Rest. There are records from the generals of this era that say, no, no. When men are sent to rest, it must be real rest. There must be a village, a river, an inn, women, so that people truly know that after fighting for a while, there are also beautiful moments. And all these things together begin to have an impact. The morale of the fighters starts to rise a little. And even in the country in general, it is one of those rare moments when, how can I put it, a certain sobriety prevails in the country. The tendency is to say we got carried away. Caporetto taught us something. For example, the military themselves are starting to criticize journalists. Famous journalists like Luigi Barzini from the Corriere della Sera were hated by the soldiers because when a soldier happened to hear an article from the Corriere della Sera describing a battle, he could not find his true life reflected in it. The newspapers spoke of heroic and glorious advances, paternal officials, flags waving in the wind, and the soldier who knew very well that things were different hated the journalists and became depressed. The same officers begin to say enough. Enough with the lies, enough with the rhetoric. Let's start telling things as they are. It will be a brief moment. Moments when we say no rhetoric always last very little, you see. But at that moment, the eternal Italy, pompous and verbose, briefly undergoes a bath of sobriety and realism. And so, in November, December, the German and Austrian offensive exhausted itself on the Piave and the Grappa. And at that point, the Germans say to the Austrians, "Are you satisfied? We came. We did what you wanted, and much more." We have pushed them back to the Piave. Now it's your turn. We need the German troops in France. By January, there won't be a single German soldier left in Italy. The usual old Austrians remain, with whom we were already more or less on equal footing before. And there is the Piave between us and them. Winter passes, spring passes. The Austrians do not have enough forces to attack, and we absolutely do not have the forces to attack either. So we remain there, looking at each other, from one side of the Piave to the other. As time goes on, spring gives way to summer. And there begins to be a feeling in the world that perhaps this year, this war could come to a conclusion. The Germans in France, we'll talk about it again, unleash a series of offensives, as if to say, either it works or it breaks. We burn everything. If it goes well, we reach Paris. The Austrians decide that they too must do something. After all, things went so well at Caporetto, but there were the Germans at Caporetto. Now the Germans are no longer there. Yet the Austrians gather all the forces they have left to attack again. They will attack to try to cross the Piave, break through, and collapse the Italian front. The offensive is scheduled for June. It is planned carefully as usual in all details. This includes the propaganda. The Imperial Post prints stamps depicting a Herculean warrior striking down a cat with a club. That cat represents us, the Italians. Here I make a small digression, since it is the last evening we can afford it, because the Italians are likened to cats. Well, there is an insulting nickname that the Austrians gave to the Italians, not only the Austrian army during the World War, but it is a nickname that dates back to the 18th century, which already referred to Italian emigrants in Austria, street vendors, and so on. This nickname was Katzelmacher, where Katzelmacher literally means cat maker. Linguists have naturally wondered where on earth this nickname comes from. And some say, well, the Italians are the ones who have many children like cats. We would say like rabbits, right? Others say no, there must be something in common with the fact that Italians eat cats. At least Italian emigrants were suspected of doing so. The real truth is that the nickname, Katzelmacher, probably derives from a word which I will not repeat here, that the Austrians constantly heard coming from the Italians. Indeed, I found another version in the letters of an Austrian officer during the war on the eve of the Piave offensive. This says, now we will show it to the little bastards. Always written with a K and TZ, of course. So, the cat makers are over there on the other side of the Piave, and this time we Austrians are going to show them. What shall we call this operation? The attack on Caporetto, carried out jointly by Germans and Austrians, was named Operation Brotherhood of Arms. This, the Austrians alone, they call it the Radetzky operation, with the idea that the Italians remember Radetzky, and we return to those good times. Some believe it, some have to pretend to believe it. Emperor Charles III, in the meantime, has died. The old Franz Joseph passed away in 16. Now there is Charles of Habsburg, the last emperor of Austria, one of the very few saints one has the opportunity to encounter while telling these stories, because Emperor Charles III, who was very Catholic, was canonized by Pope John Paul II, whose father was a sergeant in his army. Emperor Charles III therefore has the commemorative medal struck in advance for the entry into Venice. It's a bit early, but it's better to get ahead. We will break through on the Piave and go to Venice. As usual, the Italians are well aware that the offensive is coming. As always in World War I, it is completely impossible to keep preparations a secret. Thus, through phone interceptions, spies, and deserters, the Italian commands are well aware that the blow is about to come. And while before Caporetto, they had been very calm and self-assured, Now, they want to show that they have learned the lesson. What happened at Caporetto? A tide of stragglers, hundreds of thousands of stragglers. We had to set up huge camps at the last moment to accommodate all these stragglers. Now, on the eve of the Piave offensive, just to be sure, they are already preparing the fields to accommodate our stragglers in the rear. This way, if everything collapses, at least we are already ready to recover the stragglers. After Caporetto, Cadorna had to evacuate the Supreme Command in Vicenza in a hurry from one day to the next. Now, the Supreme Command is in Padua. However, if they break through on the Piave, a small group of officers from the General Staff is sent to Salso Maggiore, which seems quite far back, to look for buildings for the evacuation of the Supreme Command. If we have to abandon Padua, at least we already know where to go. But in reality, aside from this, these are the humorous aspects, but this time the Italian preparation is indeed present. This time, well, some time has passed. 8 months have gone by since Caporetto. Armies at war learn quickly. At Caporetto, the Italians faced an enemy, the Germans, who fought with technical tactics that the Italians had just begun to sense, but did not truly understand yet. And that is why we crumbled. But 8 months in war is an enormous amount of time. Our army has learned, the generals have studied, and they have put into practice the things that the Germans knew how to do, while we did not. The most important example is the use of artillery. Now I will delve into a technical aspect, but it makes no sense to talk about these battles without understanding the technical conditions in which those men were fighting and dying. What is artillery? Artillery means this. In World War I, when you attack, you are at a disadvantage. The enemy has machine guns, trenches, barbed wire, and you go to get yourself killed. This was understood from the very first months of World War I. If you go on the attack like in the old days with the bayonet fixed and the flags waving, they will massacre you. You won't even reach their trenches. Then the general's reaction was to say, so that means before we attack, we bombard them. We have some wonderful cannons. In recent years, cannons have made extraordinary progress. The scientists who are dedicated with humanitarian zeal to this cause in all countries have invented wonderful new explosives. It is not only Nobel who invented dynamite. All the laboratories are there working and producing new explosives, increasingly powerful. We all have artillery of a power that has never been seen before. So it's fine if we want to attack. It means that first we bombard them. Thus, with the artillery, we level their trenches, their barbed wire, their machine guns. Let's bombard for an entire day as well. At the beginning of World War I, it seems like a crazy thing to do, yet they go ahead with it. For 24 hours, they bombard with all the costs of the shells, which are exorbitant. It doesn't matter. For 24 hours, we bombard. And then we go on the attack. You'll see. The artillery will have flattened everything. They go on the attack. And the others come out of the trenches and the ruins, pull out the machine guns and flatten you again, just like before. How did it happen? It happens that the people in the trenches are very well defended against bombardment. And when the bombardment intensifies, they dig deeper trenches and start building concrete shelters and bunkers, leaving only a few people in the trenches, the lookouts, while the others take cover behind. As a result, bombing for a day is of no use. How does the human mind work? It works like this. The generals say, then let's bombard for 2 days. And indeed, bombing begins 2 days before the attack. Everything goes the same way. So we bombarded for 3 days. In 1916, we reached the point that before attacking on the Somme, on July 1st, 1916, the English bombarded for a week. Well, obviously, it's not like doing nothing when you bomb for a week. One wouldn't want to be in the shoes of the many Germans who are hiding in their bunkers for a week while the world explodes outside. The fact is that even after a week, it is not enough. When the English go on the attack, there are still enough Germans ready to mow them down. At this point, I am sure there were generals who said, well then, 8 days. But there are also German generals who say no. Let's think this over a bit more. The system needs to be completely changed. You start the bombardment, and the others know very well that you will bombard for days and days and days, and then you will go on the attack. So they prepare, they get organized, and they wait there. We, the Germans say, could try to do it this way. Let's bombard for just 1 hour. When the others have just begun to take cover, the bombardment ends, and our forces go on the attack, catching them by surprise. They try this, he says, let's test it first against those who are a bit weaker. They try it against the Russians in the summer and autumn of 17, and it works wonderfully. They say, let's try it against others who are also weak. They try it at Caporetto. It works wonderfully. At Caporetto, entire Italian battalions are captured in their caves because they were there expecting the bombardment to last all day. But instead, after an hour, the bombardment ends. At that point, while the officers inside are looking at each other and asking, what do we do? Is it a trick, or do we go out? The first Germans are already at the entrance of the cave saying, Italians, surrender. And the Italians who had powerful artillery at Caporetto hardly used it. Why? Because they did not know well how to use it. They were not accustomed to defending themselves. We were always the ones attacking. When you attack, the orders for the artillery are easy. Do you see that trench down there, or rather on the map? That point on the map, 8 kilometers away. You bombard that point. Bombard it with 50 shells a day. You don't need to do anything else. It's different when others are attacking you. Where do you need to shoot? Who tells you where you need to shoot? Our artillery was completely unprepared. But between Caporetto and the Piave, from October 17 to June 18th, our artillery officers also studied how the Germans respond when they are attacked. A new concept has emerged, which is counter-preparation. What does this mean? When those who want to attack you start firing. Here, in the case of Caporetto, the orders for our artillery were, be good, calm, quiet. When you have the impression that others are attacking, you might start shooting, but only a little because bullets are expensive. Now the discussion is completely different. Bullets cost patience. For once, we must hold the Piave. There is little to be done. The country is at stake. The monarchy is at stake. Whatever the cost, which for once does not mean we don't care how many deaths there will be, but rather that we don't care how much money we spend. So the artillery has these orders, counter-preparation, which is the most modern form, just learned, meaning that as soon as those with 1,000 cannons start firing at us, we respond with 2,000 cannons, and they shoot at us for an entire day. And we also shoot at them for an entire day. We shoot at their cannons, we shoot at their commands, at their warehouses, at the roads. The troops that are attacking will have to pass somewhere, right? And we shoot there, continuously, without holding back. This is the first time that the Italian artillery behaves in a modern way on the Piave. Counter-preparation means that the Austrian troops, preparing for the attack, are crushed in their starting trenches by a tide of fire. The troops, the commands, the switchboards, the phones are down. It's already starting off badly, in short. That said, the Austrians attack and are so desperate that despite everything, they cross the Piave and establish a bridgehead on this side of the Piave. The attack begins on June 15th. The Austrians come under Italian bombardment, which causes terrifying losses. However, the Austrians push forward, cross the Piave, throw down bridges, and bring many troops across. Meanwhile, it is raining. It rains, it rains, it rains. On June 15th, it rains so much that the Piave swells, and on the Italian side, they are obviously watching, praying for the river to rise. The river rises and finally washes away the Austrians' walkways. Those who have passed this way remain stuck. In the following days, the Austrians continuously throw walkways back under bombardment and ferry people to our side, but they are unable to expand. And from the very first day, the losses are terrifying. Already on the first evening, an Austrian officer notes in his diary, the offensive has completely failed. Our artillery is miserable. it fires on our own troops. Hundreds of men have drowned. They continue for 5 days. And this is the Battle of Piave. On the other side are our forces who do not know how it will end. The idea of a new Caporetto approaching is in everyone's mind. However, our forces hold on with great difficulty and enormous losses on our side as well, but the front does not collapse, and the Austrians at the bridgehead are under bombardment, and in the end, they are the ones who crumble. After 5 days, back on the 20th, the Austrian command decides that the offensive has failed. Enough, too many losses, too many dead. We abandon the bridgehead. The troops have actually already begun to abandon their positions, fleeing across the Piave in every possible way, even swimming, which is not the best idea with the Piave in flood. On the last day, an Austrian officer recounts, at dawn, after we repelled a violent attack from the Italians, why the Italians continuously attack the bridgehead to push them back across the Piave. News arrives that to the north the line has broken and that the troops are fleeing. It is the catastrophe. The remnants of the infantry clear the trenches and run towards the river. A violent fire chases them, and the yellow water of the Piave boils under the continuous explosions of the shells. The waters of the Piave carry downstream a huge number of corpses. The Battle of Piave is the true great Italian victory of this war. It is the time when the Italian army stands alone. There are still English and French forces, but the bulk is us, facing the traditional enemy, the Austrians, who are an enemy on our level. For once, the Italian army has proven to be superior. It is superior in technology, tactics, and the troops fight. Naturally, the Battle of Piave also triggers a wave of propaganda and rhetoric. It is inevitable. In all belligerent countries, propaganda reigns supreme, and rhetoric is frightening everywhere. The Battle of Piave has left some traces in the Italian collective memory. Remember the writings, for example. The photos that we have all seen at least once in our lives. The piece of wall from a fortified house with the words, either heroes or the Piave, or either all dead written on it. For a long time, there was an attempt to make people believe that a soldier had spontaneously written that thing. Then, little by little, it comes out that it was the Supreme Command that had these writings made on the walls. Inside a tavern, another writing appears that will become very famous. Better to live one day as a lion than 100 years as a sheep. Years later, a soldier will come forward and say, yes, I wrote that thing. The officer dictated it to me, and I wrote it down. But even these things matter. The newspapers talk about them, the photographs circulate, all heroes. And of course, a postal worker from Naples, who already has a certain reputation as a lyricist and songwriter, wrote a song during those days that even this morning the Alpini were playing outside. And I believe we have all heard it in our lives, the song of the Piave. The Piave murmured. The postal clerk was named Giovanni Gaeta, but he signed this song with a pseudonym, as he often did with his songs. And it is Mario. With a huge success of the song, King Victor wants to meet the author. They bring him to the Quirinale. King Victor receives John Gaeta, who has signed, as Alberto Mario, and asks him, "Excuse me, but where does this pseudonym come from?" John Gaeta says, "Oh, because I am a great admirer of Alberto Mario, who was a collaborator of Mazzini. He was a great Mazzinian." And the king says, "Ah, I see, because you..." "Yes," says Gaeta, "I am a Republican." After that, if the rumor circulating is true, which seems to be the case, it has been sold this way, a sign of the old times. The king says, "Well, Republicans have always been loyal servants of the country. I appoint her as commander of the Order of the Crown of Italy." After that, of course, I would pause for a moment, because this song that we all know is an extraordinary example of propaganda and propagandistic distortion. Because what is the situation? We are on the Piave, and we are fighting to defend the country from an enemy invasion. On the Piave, the army resists to prevent the enemy, who already occupies a piece of Italy, from advancing further, the foreigner shall not pass. But as everyone remembers, the song evokes May 24th. The Piave murmured calm and placid as the first infantry passed by on May 24th. The army was marching to reach the border to create a barrier against the enemy. Where is the distortion? Meanwhile, on May 24th, the Piave had nothing to do with it. It was in the rear, far from the front. But above all, on May 24th, 1915, the army was not marching towards the border to create a barrier against the enemy. We were going to invade them. It is us who on May 24th broke through the border and invaded Austrian Slovenia and Austrian Trentino. We were invading the enemy country. Now, after Caporetto, no one remembers it anymore. After Caporetto, the watchword is that this war is being fought to defend Italy from invasion, and even the Piave is enlisted in this battle. Well, by June 20th, 1918, the Austrian offensive, known as the Battle of the Solstice, has failed. We have won. We hold the line of the Piave. Meanwhile, what is happening in the world now means in France, because Russia is out of the war. After the revolution, Lenin kept the promise he had made, peace immediately, and signed the peace treaty. The Germans are now only fighting on the Western Front, where they face the usual old enemies, the French and the English, but also a new enemy, who may not be very experienced, but comes with many men and a lot of supplies, the Americans. Everyone has made the same calculations. The Americans will have 1 million men in France within a few months. By the end of the year, they will have 3 million. It is completely impossible to continue. Therefore, the German High Command decides that the war must be ended immediately. We are going all in. And Ludendorff, the head of the German General Staff, plans a series of offensives on the French front that will come one after another, using the same tactics that had served to crush the Italians at Caporetto. New tactics for infantry movement, the use of light weapons, and the use of artillery. These 5 offensives start one after the other, beginning in March. And the first ones have overwhelming success. The Germans, using the same tactics with which they had crushed us at Caporetto, in March 1918, crushed the English, annihilate an entire English army, and advance by 60 kilometers. But then the others are too many, and this offensive stops. The second one starts, goes on, and then stops. The third one starts in March, April, May. June marks the start of the 4th. July marks the start of the 5th. Each of these offensives results in hundreds of thousands of dead, wounded, and missing. Each time the Germans advance a little further. They are almost at Paris, but almost. And in the meantime, they are running out of everything. They are running out of reserves, men, money, ammunition, everything, and also the will. The 5th offensive that begins on July 15th is a disaster. It is stopped immediately, so much so that within 3 days, the German command decides to suspend it. At this point, the Allies launch their attack. There is now 1 million Americans. There are new weapons, and the tanks that have just been invented and are working. On August 8th, for the first time in years, the Allies launch an attack in France, and the Germans yield. The Germans begin to retreat. From that moment on, they do not stop. By mid-September, the Germans have been pushed back to the border. You know that the war was fought entirely in France because in Belgium and France, the Germans had entered. Belgium and France in 1914, they had conquered a large piece of land, and they have always held it. In September 1918, the Germans have been pushed back to their borders, and it seems they cannot stop. It is clear to everyone that the war is coming to an end, and that the Germans and Austrians have lost. On September 13th, Emperor Charles of Austria informs the Allies that he wants to open negotiations to seek peace. On October 5th, the Germans will also contact American President Wilson to say that they would be willing to discuss peace. And so, throughout all these months, on June 20th, we witnessed the failure of the Austrian offensive, while in France, the 4th of the major German offensives was being fought. In July, the fifth German offensive in France is unleashed and fails immediately, while we remain stagnant on the Piave. In August, the Allies attack in France and repel the Germans, while we remain stagnant on the Piave. In September, Emperor Charles announces that he wants to negotiate peace. And we are standing still on the Piave because no one at the Italian Supreme Command thinks that we have the forces to attempt an attack ourselves. We are standing still. In Rome, the politicians are starting to worry, because from Rome's perspective, the situation is, gentlemen, this war is about to end. And if this war ends, and the others in France push the Germans back into Germany, invade Germany, and we are still on the Piave with the enemy in our home, and the war ends with the enemy in our home, what kind of image do we present? With what face do we then go to the Allies to say we want Bolzano, Istria, Dalmatia? They will tell us, but in the meantime, if we regain Veneto, therefore the politics in Rome, which is perfectly right about this and sees very clearly how things will go, begins to be concerned because the army is not moving. In July, the first phone calls start from Rome to Diaz and his deputy, Badoglio, saying, guys, maybe you should move. We are not ready yet. In August, the Prime Minister, Vittorio Emanuele Orlando, goes in person to Padua, to the Supreme Command, to tell Diaz and Badoglio that they absolutely must attack. We need a victory, literally. Even a small victory, something trivial. But we must be able to put a victory on the table. Diaz responds that he does not accept political pressure, and that rather Orlando should resign. Orlando, the Prime Minister, will later say in his memoirs, at that point I thought about it, but I did not know who to put in his place. So nothing comes of it, but Orlando insists, you must attack in the end. The Chief of Staff, the Deputy, Chief Badoglio tells him, listen, we know that we are not ready to attack. If the government wants to force us to attacking, it must give us a written order. It's something never seen before. The government doesn't give orders to the military. Orlando says, no, I won't give you the written order. The responsibility is yours. Badoglio responds, but then why does he come all the way up here to congratulate us? It seems that Badoglio, being a good Piedmontese farmer with Italian, has always had some moments of doubt. At this point, Diaz has a great idea. We need to do something, but we can't do it alone. Let's see if the Allies are willing to transfer their entire army to Italy and attack alongside us. Diaz goes to Paris on September 6th and brings the proposal to transfer the bulk of the French army to Italy, saying, and you with the Germans, it's difficult, they are tough. If you come to us, the Austrians will collapse. The French tell him to be patient, Diaz, but at this point, Diaz has another brilliant idea. There are the Americans. He goes to the general commanding the American army in France, General Pershing, who recounts in his memoirs that Diaz arrived and said to him, we would need 20 American divisions in Italy, 1 million men. Pershing says, he was used to being asked for everything. Because you understand how the Americans and Uncle Sam arrived. They are extremely wealthy. They have everything. Everyone goes to them. And so, Pershing says, he didn't bat an eye because he was used to being asked for the most outrageous things. Seeing that I didn't flinch, Diaz immediately increased it, saying 25 divisions. Pershing says, alas, I was astonished that a man in that position could seriously make such speeches. He asks, Diaz, but why don't you attack? And Diaz says, we are studying the matter. But if we attack now, we risk running out of reserves in the spring. Do you understand? It's September 1918. The Germans have almost been pushed back to their borders. And Diaz suggests that we will attack next spring. From Rome, they insist that you must not attack first. At this point, Diaz studies a plan, having it reviewed by his staff for a small attack across the Piave. The plan is ready by the end of September. On September 29th, a meeting of the generals is held to decide
You believe they should have decided the date of the offensive. Instead, they set the date for a future meeting in which they will decide the date of the offensive. They scheduled the meeting for 2 weeks later, on October 12th. At that point, it will have been a month since Emperor Charles has already stated that he wants peace, and even the Germans have said the same. In Rome, politics is tumultuous. It will end up like in 1866, a ridiculous war in which our allies win, and we end up looking foolish as usual. It's a disgrace. It can't be. The chamber is tumultuous. The army must attack. Orlando, the prime minister, sends a telegram to the Supreme Command. Between inaction and defeat. I prefer defeat. Move. Meanwhile, the world is collapsing. On September 29th, Bulgaria, an ally of the Central Powers, signed the peace. It is clear that it is a matter of a few weeks. Not only is the world collapsing, here, I pause for a moment on this. Austria is collapsing. The Austrian Empire is disintegrating on its own. Because while Emperor Charles has contacted Wilson, the American president, and is willing to make peace based on Wilson's 14 points, which stated self-determination for peoples, Emperor Charles moves forward, even preceding Wilson. On October 16th, Emperor Charles issues a proclamation declaring that the Polish regions of the empire are free to leave. If they want to unite with other Polish territories and form a new Poland, they can do so. And the Hungarian part can be independent if it wants, and the Austrian part will become a federal state consisting of 4 nationalities: German, Czech, Yugoslav, and Ukrainian. This officially proclaims Emperor Charles on October 16th. The Americans respond, it is now too late. These peoples will do what they want and not what you offer. Peace will only be achieved on the basis that every nationality of the Austrian Empire decides freely what it wants to do. Indeed, on October 14th, a Czechoslovak national government was already formed within the Austrian Empire, which declared war on Austria. Croatia, a region of the Austrian Empire, is negotiating with Serbia, an enemy country, to create Yugoslavia. On October 28th, Czechoslovakia is proclaimed independent. On October 29th, Yugoslavia is proclaimed. On October 31st, Hungary declares its independence. This is what happens during the month of October. On October 12th, we held a meeting to decide when to begin the attack. They decided to start it on October 18th, without rushing precisely. It will later be revealed that the Austrian parliamentarians designated to come and ask us for the armistice had been ready since October 13th. Their credentials for negotiation were dated October 13th. However, the Austrian command said, well, as long as the Italians do not move, and as long as our army holds, we will wait and see. Diaz ordered the attack for October 18th. What happens on October 18th on the Piave? It rains, it pours, the Piave is in flood, impassable. They are postponed by a week to October 24th. The good thing is that it is the anniversary of Caporetto. Meanwhile, the Austro-Hungarian army is beginning to disintegrate on its own. On October 20th, the first Hungarian regiments in the Sugana Valley decide to mutiny and set off to return to Hungary. Finally, on October 24th, we attack. We first attack on the Grappa to draw the attention of the Austrians there. And then, after 2 days, we attack on the Piave to cross it and break through. The Battle of Vittorio Veneto begins, which in the first days is a real battle, it must be said. Those first 2 days when our forces attack on Grappa are heavy days, because the Austro-Hungarian army, despite being the army of an empire that is coming to an end, still has the will to fight against the Italians. Therefore, in the early days, the Austrians hold their ground.
On the evening of the 26th, the first walkways are thrown across the Piave. During the night, the flood sweeps everything away. On the night of the 27th, the bridges are rebuilt. But on the 28th, the Piave sweeps them away again. However, in the meantime, our troops are crossing. There is a first bridgehead beyond the Piave. By the 29th, we have large forces beyond the Piave. And at this point, the Battle of Vittorio Veneto is actually over, because the Austro-Hungarian army decides that enough is enough. The Austrian troops are largely made up of men, from whose homeland new governments are proclaiming independence, peace, and so on. No one wants to fight anymore, aside from the fact that they are starving. The Austrian prisoners captured at Vittorio Veneto will weigh an average of 45 kilograms each. After that, the Austrians begin to retreat, and on October 29th at 10 in the morning, the day when the independence of Yugoslavia is proclaimed in Zagreb, the Austrian parliamentarians arrive to request an armistice, while the Austrian command orders the troops, those few who still obey, to retreat to the border. It's that thing that Diaz will say in the victory proclamation, right? They climb back up the valleys they had descended with proud confidence, but apparently everything is going wonderfully. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, our old secular enemy, is disappearing. In its place, new countries are being born. We should be very happy. In reality, be careful, Italian politics has known from the very beginning that this war is being fought to impose our hegemony in the Adriatic and the Balkans. So, it is not said that we are so happy. Certainly, if Poland is born, we don't care at all. Czechoslovakia is also fine, but Yugoslavia is not. Our politicians do not like the idea of Yugoslavia at all. Instead of many small states, a large state is emerging at our border, and it is already well known that the Yugoslavs will say Trieste at the peace negotiations. But Trieste is Slavic, Gorizia, but Gorizia is Slavic. Istria, Rijeka, Dalmatia, not even for an idea. So for us, in reality, Yugoslavia is a nightmare. I will tell you a specific episode. Many of you may have heard it mentioned because as children, we even studied the sinking of the Viribus Unitis in school. The Viribus Unitis is an Austro-Hungarian battleship, one of the few that remain anchored in the port of Pula. On the evening of October 31st, with an assault group action in which we excel, our Navy has always been skilled in these matters. 2 small boats enter the port of Pola with a new special weapon, a mobile mine that is secretly attached under the deck of the battleship Viribus Unitis. Then the 2 divers, Paolucci and Rossetti, who will both receive the gold medal for this, obviously, come out. The Austrians see them, capture them, and shortly after, the Viribus Unitis blows up and sinks with a large part of its crew and its commander, October 31st. It's a pity that on October 29th, the independence of Yugoslavia had been proclaimed. And on October 30th, Emperor Charles had gifted his fleet to Yugoslavia. So on October 31st, just a few hours before Paolucci and Rossetti arrived in the port of Pola to mine the battleship, aboard the battleship Viribus Unitis. The name is an old slogan of the Austrian Empire, meaning with united forces. It was evidently also pleasing to the Yugoslavs. Aboard the Viribus Unitis, Admiral Horthy, the commander-in-chief of the Austrian Navy, had solemnly handed over the battleship to the Yugoslav representatives. The battleship had raised the Yugoslav flag, and the commander of the battleship, Captain Janko Vukovic von Podkapelski, had taken command of the Yugoslav fleet. A few hours later, we sink the main battleship of the Yugoslav fleet, with its Croatian crew on board, and with the commander of the Yugoslav Navy who drowns during the sinking of the battleship. And I don't know if Paolucci and Rossetti were aware, but their commands certainly knew very well what was happening. And no one said, well, since the battleship is now Yugoslav, let's forget about it. On the contrary. Thus, on October 29th, the Austrians request the armistice. They would be ready to sign it immediately. After all, it is all over now. Austria no longer exists.
and the army is retreating in disorder, while the Italians pursue. At this point, it is us who are dragging things out. Why should we sign an armistice? When the enemy is fleeing, we pursue them, capture prisoners, liberate the occupied homeland, and move forward. And would we be so foolish as to stop? No, no. The Austrian negotiator at Villa Giusti in Padua, General Weber von Webenau, as soon as the talks begin, declares that they have practically already laid down their arms, do not intend to fight anymore, and request an immediate cessation of hostilities and to halt the Italian advance. The Italian negotiators respond, not even a chance. Now we discuss the clauses of the armistice. And until we have put the clauses of the armistice in writing, our army continues to attack and pursue. We push forward as much as we can. Finally, when there are no more excuses, Austria has ceded everything we asked for. And at 1840, on November 3rd, the armistice is signed. We still manage to pull off a trick. It is signed at 1840 on November 3rd. But it will come into effect at 15 Nach the following day. Thousands of Austrian soldiers who did not understand this, that evening, that night, and the following morning see the Italians arriving, greet them cheerfully, and are immediately captured and taken prisoner. By the end of all this, our forces are almost in Innsbruck. We landed in Trieste. By the skin of our teeth, we managed to get what we wanted. We have 300,000 prisoners in our hands, almost all men who believed that the war was over and were returning home. Instead, they will remain in Italian captivity for several more months, assigned to forced labor. I must say there are very rare testimonies of these Austrian prisoners who remained in captivity until March-April of 1919 in Italy. The imprisonment of Italians in Austria had been terrifying due to the tremendous hunger in the camps. But the testimonies of Austrian prisoners held in Italy until the 19th, the few that I have read only speak of that. Fame, desperate fame, mistreatment, the very same thing that our people suffered in the camps. After that, we won. We won the Battle of Vittorio Veneto and we won the war. And it's like saying, it's not a good moment to look at it from now because our side is losing its head. Diaz writes to his wife during the days of the negotiations. We negotiate and impose our conditions. If by chance the Austrians do not accept our conditions, and here I quote, we will continue and it will be a disaster for the enemy army, after which we will move against Germany wherever it resists. And so it will be us who give peace to France instead of receiving it. This is what the commander of the Italian army writes in those days when the Germans are collapsing on the Western Front and the French are about to enter Germany. But we say, we have won the war for everyone. The Italian newspapers obviously go wild. Mussolini more than anyone else. One headline from Il Popolo d'Italia stands out, emblematic of the spirit of the time. The holy cause of civilization triumphs. Where we are, the holy cause of civilization. Reading today is easy. I know it is easy. That was the mentality back then. It may even be unkind to distance ourselves from it now, but it is necessary to do so. One reads certain articles by Italian journalists accompanying the troops, these troops that are gradually pushing back the Austrians and reoccupying the occupied territories, writes Guelfo Civinini in the Corriere della Sera, where the Austrian has been and his stench and filth remain. And the roads he fled along are strewn with helmets, weapons, filthy rags, and muddy straps that came loose in his flight from his louse-infested shins. It does not seem to debate the roots of an army's retreat, but rather those by which an invasion of gypsies has been driven away from its foul encampments. In short, to conclude, Prezzolini was right. He loved paradoxes, and at one point wrote that for Italy, Caporetto was a victory, and Vittorio Veneto a defeat. Caporetto has done us good, and Vittorio Veneto has done us harm. Caporetto has elevated us, says Prezzolini, and Vittorio Veneto has lowered us. Because one becomes great, by resisting misfortune and atoning for one's faults, while one becomes small by inflating oneself with lies and resurrecting bad instincts simply by winning. This is what Prezzolini said. I am not saying it, but there is truth in it. This does not take away from the fact that our grandparents fought in that war. My grandfather was also there in the Third Army, the undefeated Third Army of the Duke of Aosta. Our grandparents and great-grandparents fought that war. 600,000 of them were killed. They went through things that are unimaginable today. In the end, they won. But that victorious country discovered that it was a country with broken bones, deeply in debt, with terrifying unemployment, a widespread social malaise. And everyone was saying, we should be getting a lot from this victory. They don't want to give us everything we deserve. We should be strong, powerful in command, have an empire. They don't want to give it to us, but we will show them next time. Well, Italy did not come out well from that war. If you think about it, the countries that won that war, England and France, also emerged devastated with a severely damaged economy, terrifying unemployment, and strikes. But there were no social upheavals there. Democracy held firm. Democracy went to hell in the post-war period in the defeated countries, amidst revolutions and counter-revolutions in Germany, Austria, and Hungary. Italy, when one looks at what happened in the post-war period, resembles the defeated countries more than those that truly won the war. And this is also something worth reflecting on. Thank you.